Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator and Tana the Bloodsower. This deck, referred to as Teamer Pirates, is a proactive deck. It seeks to win the game through its mainline combo of Malcolm and Glenhorn Buccaneer. It also has the backup win con of Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker and Corridor Monitor. It has multiple ways of getting these combos online, including tutors, birthing pod lines, as well as Spellseeker and Recruiter lines. This deck is fast, resilient, and reliable. Sean wins the 4 Curious Control Pod subgame challenge and gets to start us off. Sean draws a card for turn and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Volcanic Island. He plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He passes. Zane draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Soul Ring. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand and adds a red. He casts Lightning Rig Crew. He passes. Noah draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Cascade Bluffs. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He ships the turn. Cal draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He also casts Mox Diamond, discarding Tropical Island. Zane suddenly feels very left out, and Cal casts Llanowar Elves. He passes. Sean draws and plays a Tundra. He casts Sylvan Library. All finished up, he ships the turn to Zane. During Zane's upkeep, Sean casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting both Zane's and Noah's Soul Rings. In response, Zane hard casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Force of Vigor. In response, Sean casts Veil of Summer. Veil resolves, and Sean draws. Fierce fizzles, and Force of Vigor resolves, destroying both Soul Rings. Zane draws, curses Sean's name, takes no other actions, and gives the turn to Noah. Noah draws and also curses Sean's name. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Krark's Thumb. He passes. Cal draws and casts Rhystic Study. Cal passes. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays a Waterlogged Grove for turn. He casts a Mana Crypt, paying for Rhystic. Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Zane activates Lightning Rig Crew and each opponent takes 1. The turn moves to Zane. Zane draws and casts a Mana Vault. Rhystic triggers and Cal draws. All finished up, Zane passes. Noah draws, takes no actions, and passes. Cal draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He taps his Spire of Industry to help cast Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. He passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing an Eldritch Evolution into his hand. The turn moves to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. He casts Finehorn Elves. He passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Zane activates Lightning Rig Crew and each opponent takes 1. Zane draws and casts his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. Lightning Rig Crew and Rhystic trigger. Zane pays for Rhystic and, holding priority, activates Lightning Rig Crew, pinging each opponent for 1. In response, Sean casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Lightning Rig Crew. Rhystic triggers and Cal draws. Swords resolves and Lightning Rig Crew is exiled. Zane passes. At the end of Zane's turn, Noah casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Kinnan. Krark and Rhystic trigger. Noah taps the City of Brass to help pay for Rhystic. Noah flips twice through Krark's Thumb, ignoring 1 flip. He flips 2 tails, curses Sean's name again for some reason no one understands, and then the turn moves to Noah. Noah draws and casts Lightning Bolt, again targeting Kinnan. Krark and Rhystic trigger. Cal draws and Noah flips for Krark. He double flips and chooses Copy. Krark copies Lightning Bolt, and the copy targets Cal's Malcolm. Both Lightning Bolts resolve, and Malcolm and Kinnan are destroyed. Noah passes. Cal draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. He casts Finehorn Elves. He taps his Spire of Industry to help cast Mystic Remora. In response, Sean casts Delay, targeting Mystic Remora. Rhystic triggers and Sean pays. Delay resolves, countering and exiling Mystic Remora with 3 time counters on it. Cal ends his turn. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, putting 2 back on top. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos, paying for Rhystic. It enters, and he fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He taps his Flooded Grove to help cast Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Ranger Captain as an additional cost. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. In response, Noah casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Eldritch Evolution. Krark and Rhystic trigger. Noah taps his City of Brass to help pay for Rhystic. Then Noah flips twice, choosing heads. Krark copies his Fierce, and he targets Eldritch. In response, Sean casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting the Fierce Guardianship copy. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. SWAT resolves, redirecting the Fierce copy to the original Fierce Guardianship. Fierce counters Fierce, and Eldritch resolves. Sean fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. The table knows this is trouble, and Sean passes the turn. Sean untaps with Zane through Seedborn. During his draw step, Zane takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Malcolm. Sean takes it, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. Zane passes. At the end of Zane's turn, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Flusterstorm into his hand. Sean untaps with Noah. Noah draws and casts Gamble, Krark and Rhystic trigger. In response to both, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Crop Rotation into his hand. Cal draws off of Rhystic, and Noah flips twice, losing both flips. Noah taps the City of Brass to cast Gamble again, Krark and Rhystic trigger. Cal draws off of Rhystic, and Noah flips twice, choosing Copy this time. His copy resolves, and he fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards a Heat Shimmer. Then the original resolves, and he fetches up another card into hand, and then randomly discards a Submerge. With nothing else, Noah passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cal removes a Suspend counter from Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Guide as Cradle. He casts Twin Flame, targeting Malcolm. He holds priority and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He taps his Spire of Industry to help flash in a Dualcaster Mage. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Temple Garden onto the battlefield tapped. Then Dualcaster enters and targets Twin Flame. In response, Sean casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Dualcaster, paying for Rhystic. Dualcaster is destroyed, and then the Dualcaster's trigger resolves, creating a copy of Twin Flame, targeting Finehorn Elves. Both Twin Flames resolve, and Cal creates a copy of both creatures, with his copy of Malcolm getting sacked immediately. Plans foiled, Cal attacks Sean with Malcolm. Sean takes it, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Ledger Shredder. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Zane casts Alchemist Retrieval, targeting his own Mana Vault. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. Mana Vault is bounced, and the turn moves to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, putting 2 back on top. He plays an island for turn. He casts Esper Sentinel, paying for Rhystic. He casts his other commander, Bruce Tarl, Boorish Herder. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. Bruce Tarl enters and gives Seedborn Muse double strike and lifelink until end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Seedborn Muse. Noah takes it, and Sean gains 4. Sean passes. Zane draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Malcolm. Sean takes it, and Zane creates a treasure through Malcolm. In his second main phase, he recasts Mana Vault. Rhystic and Esper trigger. Sean and Cal both draw, and then Zane ships the turn. Noah draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Worldly Tutor into his hand. Then Dockside resolves, and Noah creates 9 treasures. He plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Rhystic and Ledger Shredder trigger. Cal draws off of Rhystic and then connives from Ledger Shredder, discarding a Breeding Pool. In response to Sakashima, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield tapped. Then Sakashima resolves and enters as a copy of Krark. Noah casts Geistwave, targeting his own Dockside. Krark, Sakashima, Rhystic, and Esper trigger. Sean draws off of Esper, then Noah pays for Rhystic, and in response to both Krark triggers, Zane casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic and Esper trigger, and Sean and Cal draw. Then Ad Naus resolves. Zane reveals a Talisman of Indulgence, Cyclonic Rift, Mox Diamond, Mana Crypt, Swan Song, Professional Facebreaker, Tainted Pact, Phantasmal Image, Mox Opal, Diabolic Intent, Bloodstained Mire, Chrome Mox, Chain of Vapor, Imperial Seal, Demonic Consultation, Flooded Strand, Cabal Ritual, An Offer You Can't Refuse, Pyroblast, Polluted Delta, Gamble, Training Center, Felwar Stone, Misty Rainforest, Dark Ritual, Blood Crypt, Miscast, Luxury Suite, and Appear into the Abyss, deciding to stop there. With Geistwave back on the stack, Sean casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Geistwave. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. Red Blast counters the original Geistwave. Then Noah double flips for Krark, choosing Copy. Geistwave is copied and targets Dockside. Dockside is bounced, and Noah draws. Sakashima double rolls, and Noah chooses Copy again. Then Geistwave is copied, Noah bounces his Mox Diamond, and then Noah draws again. He recasts Dockside, paying for Rhystic. It enters, and he creates 7 treasures. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Kark, Sakashima, and Rhystic trigger. Cal draws off of Rhystic, and Noah double flips, choosing copy. The copy resolves, bouncing his opponent's non-land permanents. Then he double flips, both come up heads, so he copies it again. His opponent's non-land permanents are bounced, again. Then the original Cyclonic Rift resolves, really sending the message that his opponent's non-land permanents need to be in their hands. He recasts Mox Diamond, discarding a mountain. Unfortunately, he didn't draw the cards he needed and has to pass the turn. During his upkeep, Cal removes a suspend counter from Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Snapcaster Mage. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Ancient Tomb. He casts Finehorn Elves. He follows it up with Llanowar Elves. He recasts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He taps his Fire of Industry to help recast Ledger Shredder. He passes, discarding to hand size. Sean draws and recasts his Mana Crypt. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Verdant Catacombs. Ledger Shredder triggers and Cal connives, discarding Professional Facebreaker, giving Ledger Shredder a +1/+1 counter. He plays an Emergence Zone. He casts Esper Sentinel. He recasts Seedborn Muse. He recasts his commander, Thrasios Triton Hero. He passes. Sean untaps with Zane through Seedborn Muse. Zane draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding Bloodstained Mire. Esper triggers and Sean draws. He casts a Mana Crypt. Shredder triggers and Cal connives, discarding Swansong, giving Ledger Shredder a counter. He casts Mox Opal. He follows it up with a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, creating 7 treasures. He casts Mana Vault. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Imperial Seal. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He recasts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He casts Glenhorn Buccaneer. In response, Sean activates Emergence Zone. In response, Zane casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. Then the Emergence Zone activation resolves. Sean flashes in a Training Grounds. In response, Zane casts Pyroblast, targeting Thrasios. In response, Sean pays 2 life to help cast Mental Misstep, targeting Pyroblast. In response, Zane casts Miscast, targeting Sean's Misstep. In response, Sean casts Worldly Tutor. In response, Zane casts Swansong, targeting Training Grounds, which is still on the stack. In response, Sean casts Flusterstorm, with 5 copies targeting Pyroblast and the rest at Swansong. In response, Zane casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting his own Swansong. With nothing else, Swansong is countered, Zane creates 2 treasures, Flusterstorm counters Pyroblast, Miscast counters Misstep, Worldly Tutor resolves, and Sean fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. With Training Grounds still on the stack, Zane casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Sean taps his Waterlogged Grove to help cast Crop Rotation, sacrificing Waterlogged Grove. In response, Zane casts Tainted Pact. It resolves and exiles from the top of his library until he reveals a Force of Will, putting it into his hand. He casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting and countering Crop Rotation. Still in response to Cyclonic Rift, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Then, Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing his opponent's non-land permanents. Then, Training Grounds resolves. With Glenhorn back on the stack, Sean flashes in a Mana Crypt. Then Glenhorn finally resolves. Sean asks Cal and Noah if they actually wanted to, help out at any point during that whole debacle, and they both shrug and said they didn't want to take all of his glory. Zane attacks Cal with Glenhorn. Cal takes it, and Zane creates a treasure through Malcolm. He presents a loop of activating Glenhorn, pinging his opponents, drawing and discarding, and creating treasures through Malcolm. He does this until the table is dead, and Zane wins the game. Trey wins the most style points for sleeves and playmat, and gets to start us off. Trey draws a card for turn, and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Mana Drain. He casts a Lotus Petal. He cracks his petal to help cast a turn 1 Aura of Silence. The entire table considers running away immediately, thinks better of it, and Trey passes the turn. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Training Center. Staring at his hand sadly, Cal passes. McCoy draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Llanowar Elves and gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. Adam ends his turn. Trey draws and plays an island. He casts his commander, Tameshi, Reality Architect. Trey passes to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Jeweled Lotus, paying 2 for Aura of Silence. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Cal ships the turn to McCoy. McCoy draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Mystic Remora. McCoy passes. Adam draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Dark Confidant and gives the turn to Trey. Trey draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He activates Tameshi for 0, returning Hallowed Fountain to his hand. Tameshi triggers and Trey draws. He then returns Lotus Petal from his graveyard to the battlefield. He pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Malcolm. Trey passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks McCoy with Malcolm. McCoy takes it, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal channels Boseiju, who endures, targeting Aura of Silence. In response, Trey sacrifices it, destroying McCoy's Mystic Remora. Now freed up, Cal casts Mana Crypt. He follows it up with an Imperial Recruiter. It enters, and he fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer into his hand. Feeling much better about his situation, Cal ends his turn. McCoy draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. During his upkeep, Adam reveals a Reanimate through Dark Confidant. He draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He ships the turn to Trey. Trey draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Tundra for turn. He casts Seal of Removal. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with Malcolm. Adam takes it, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. In his second main phase, Trey activates Tameshi for 3, returning Tundra to his hand. Tameshi triggers, and he draws. He then returns Aura of Silence from his graveyard to the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Glinthorn Buccaneer. In response, Trey sacrifices Seal of Removal, targeting Cal's Malcolm. In response, Cal casts Veil of Summer. In response, McCoy casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Veil of Summer. Flusterstorm counters Veil of Summer, Seal of Removal bounces Malcolm, and Glenhorn Buccaneer resolves. Unfortunately thwarted, Cal ends his turn. During his upkeep, McCoy wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, looks at his hand despondent, and passes. During his upkeep, Adam reveals a Yawgmoth's Will through Dark Confidant. He draws and plays a Luxury Suite for turn. He casts Limdul's Vault. He looks at the top 5 and doesn't like what he sees. He pays a life to look at the next 5. He decides to keep this set, shuffles, and rearranges. Adam then passes the turn. During his upkeep, Trey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats a mana and sacrifices it. He then fetches up a Mox Diamond onto the battlefield, discarding Oboro, Palace in the Sky. He plays a Tundra for turn. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with Malcolm. Adam takes it, Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. In his second main phase, Trey activates Tameshi for 0, returning Tundra to his hand. Tameshi triggers, and Trey draws a card. He returns Urza Saga from his graveyard to the battlefield. Urza Saga triggers, getting its first counter. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. He activates Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He activates Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top of his library. He casts an Arcane Signet. Trey passes. At the end of Trey's turn, McCoy casts Resculpt, targeting Cal's Glenhorn. Glenhorn exiles, and Cal creates a 4/4 elemental. The turn moves to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and recasts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He moves to combat, attacking Adam with his elemental. Adam takes it, and Cal ends his turn. During his upkeep, McCoy loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, still doesn't see the action he needs, and ships the turn to Adam. During his upkeep, Adam reveals a Mystical Tutor through Dark Confidant. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts a Soul Ring and gives the turn to Trey. During his upkeep, Trey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Tundra for turn. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. He activates Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He activates Tameshi for 1, returning Tundra to his hand. Tameshi triggers, and Trey draws. He returns Seal of Removal from his graveyard to the battlefield. He then activates Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with his copy of Malcolm. Adam takes it, Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. Trey passes. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with his Elemental token and Trey with Malcolm. Adam blocks with Dark Confidant. Confidant dies, and Trey takes it, triggering Malcolm, creating a treasure. All through, the turn moves to McCoy. During his upkeep, McCoy wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a City of Brass for turn. He passes. Adam draws and casts a Reanimate, targeting his Dark Confidant. It enters, and Adam loses 2 life. He casts an Arcane Signet and ends his turn. During his upkeep, Trey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats a mana and sacrifices it. He fetches up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He casts Mishra's Bauble. He cracks it, looking at the top card of McCoy's library, and then Trey assures him that he's in for a treat. Trey plays a Tundra for turn. He activates Tameshi for 0, returning Tundra to his hand. Tameshi triggers, and Trey draws a card. He returns Urza Saga from his graveyard to the battlefield. Urza Saga triggers, getting its first counter. Forgetting about the land drop from before, he once again plays a Tundra. Whoops, magic is hard. He activates Tameshi for 0, returning Tundra to his hand. He returns Mishra's Bauble from the graveyard to the battlefield. He cracks Mishra's Bauble, looking at the top card of Cal's library. Trey then moves to combat, attacking Adam with Malcolm. Adam takes it, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. Trey ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cal loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Also in Cal's upkeep, Trey draws 2 cards through his Mishra's Bauble. He draws and casts a Tender Wall. He moves to combat, attacking Adam with the Elemental and Trey with Malcolm. Adam blocks with Dark Confidant. Confidant dies again, and Trey takes it, triggering Malcolm, creating a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal transmutes Muddle the Mixture, fetching up a Twin Flame into his hand. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, McCoy casts Geist Wave, targeting Drannith Magistrate. In response, Trey hard casts Force of Will, countering Geist Wave. The turn moves to McCoy. During his upkeep, McCoy wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. He passes. Adam draws and casts Rhystic Study. He casts a Mystical Tutor. In response, Trey casts a Mystical Tutor of his own. Trey fetches up a Capture of Jingxiao onto the top of his library. Then Adam fetches up a Cyclonic Rift onto the top of his library. Adam sends the turn to Trey. During his upkeep, Trey loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He sacrifices Aura of Silence, destroying Rhystic Study. He casts Surveyor's Scope. He activates Surveyor's Scope, exiling it and fetching up 2 islands onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with Malcolm. Adam takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Trey casts Capture of Jingxiao. In response, McCoy taps his City of Brass to help cast Muddle the Mixture. In response, Trey hard casts Force of Negation. In response, Cal cracks his treasures to cast Mana Drain, targeting Capture of Jingxiao. Mana Drain counters Capture, and Force of Negation counters Muddle the Mixture, exiling it. Next, Trey plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Mystic Sanctuary onto the battlefield. It enters untapped, and Trey puts Capture of Jingxiao from his graveyard onto the top of his library. He then activates Tameshi for 3, returning Urza Saga to his hand. Tameshi triggers, and Trey draws. He returns Aura of Silence from his graveyard to the battlefield. All set up for the next turn, Trey passes the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 5 colorless through Mana Drain. He casts Twin Flame, targeting Imperial Recruiter. Holding priority, he flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. In response, Trey sacrifices Seal of Removal, bouncing Imperial Recruiter to Cal's hand. Dualcaster enters, and Cal copies Twin Flame, targeting Dualcaster Mage. Cal demonstrates a loop of copying Twin Flame with Dualcaster and targeting Dualcaster Mage to make a copy of it. He repeats this process until he has 1 billion Dualcaster Mages with haste. He moves to combat and attacks with his army, and Cal wins the game. Sean wins the Skyline Chili eating competition and gets to start us off. But Alex has 2 pre-game actions. He puts Leyline of Anticipation onto the battlefield and Leyline of the Void onto the battlefield. Sean draws a card for turn and plays a Fiery Islet. He taps his Fiery Islet to cast a turn 1 Mystic Remora. Already sitting in an equally strong position as Alex, Sean passes the turn. Alex draws a card for turn and plays an Exotic Orchard. With his Leyline of Anticipation providing him the ability to play when it's most strategic for him, he passes the turn. Zane draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Finehorn Elves. Zane passes. Mike draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Mike cracks his Lotus, exiling it to Leyline of the Void to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Sean taps his Fiery Islet to pay for his Remora. He draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts a Wild Growth on his Rejuvenating Springs. Mana set up and his Remora well fed, Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex flashes in a Deathrite Shaman through Leyline of Anticipation. Alex draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Alex passes. Zane draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Then Sean draws through Remora. Zane casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He follows it up with a Tender Wall. Zane passes. At the end of Zane's turn, Mike casts a Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Mike fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Sean draws. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. The table knows this is trouble and Dockside resolves. It enters and Mike creates 5 treasures. Mike moves to combat and attacks Sean with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Mike creates a warrior tapped and attacking Sean. Sean takes it, and with no other actions, Mike gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Tropical Island for turn. He taps his Fiery Islet to cast a Mana Vault. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand and adds a red. He casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Trade Routes. He ships the turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex flashes in a Talisman of Dominance. Remora triggers and Sean draws. The turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and, still sitting on his ley line of anticipation, takes no actions and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zane loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Sean. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Zane then adds 7 red and exiles Chrome Mox, Gemstone Caverns, and a Birds of Paradise. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. The table braces as he pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. Remora and Crom trigger and Sean draws for both. To everyone's surprise, Birthing Pod resolves. He pays 2 life to activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Finehorn Elves. Everyone knows what powerful 2-drop creature he's going to get. Mike, sitting on a pile of treasures, passes priority on the activation. The ability resolves, and Zane fetches up Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Then Mike decides not to crack his treasures. Zane then creates 14 treasures. Zane casts Neoform, sacrificing Dockside Extortionist. Zane fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer onto the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter through Neoform. He attempts to move to combat, but in response, Alex taps his talisman to help cast Praetor's Grasp, targeting Mike. Remora triggers and Sean draws. It's at this point that Mike explains how his list is extremely greedy and runs next to no removal spells. Mike and Alex discuss for a long time, and eventually, Alex exiles a card from Mike's library face down. Alex then casts March of Swirling Mists, exiling a blue card, targeting both Glenhorn Buccaneer and Malcolm. Remora and Crom trigger, and in response, Zane casts Swan Song, targeting March of Swirling Mists. Remora triggers and Zane pays. In response, Mike casts Eladamri's Call. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Mike fetches up a Derevi Imperial Tactician into his hand. With Swan Song still on the stack, Alex pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Swan Song. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Misstep counters Swan Song, and Sean draws off of his Crom and Remora. Finally, March of Swirling Mists resolves, and Glenhorn and Malcolm are phased out. With nothing else, Zane passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Mike attempts to move to combat, but in response, Zane casts Snap, targeting Derevi. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Snap resolves, Derevi bounces, and Zane untaps 2 lands. Mike moves to combat and attacks Sean with Nagila and a warrior token. Nagila triggers and he creates 2 more warriors, tapped and attacking Sean. Sean declares no blocks and takes it all. In his second main phase, Mike casts Imperial Seal. Crom and Remora trigger, and Sean draws for both. In response, Sean pays 2 life to help cast Mental Misstep, countering Imperial Seal. With its plans foiled, Mike passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean sacrifices his Mystic Remora. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He follows it up with a Lotus Cobra. He plays a Windswept Teeth for turn. Cobra triggers and he adds a green. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adds another green, and casts his other commander, Kodama of the East Tree. In response, Alex casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Kodama. In response, Sean casts Swan Song, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Trap is countered and Alex creates a 2/2 bird. Kodama enters, and then Sean cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Kodama and Lotus Cobra trigger. He adds a green through Cobra, and then he puts a Taiga onto the battlefield through Kodama. Lotus Cobra triggers again, and he adds another green. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Lotus Cobra as an additional cost. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. It enters, Kodama triggers, and in response, Mike and Zane crack their treasures. Then Sean creates 6 treasures and gets 6 more Kodama triggers. He puts a Mana Confluence, Gemstone Caverns, Yavimaya Coast, and an Exotic Orchard onto the battlefield, and then finally a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Tireless Tracker. Kodama triggers and he puts an Endurance onto the battlefield. Endurance enters, and Alex puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library. Sean taps his Fiery Islet to cast Shatter Skull Smashing, where X equals 4, killing Mike's Dockside and Nagila. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Crom. Mike takes it, and Sean, dismayed that he couldn't piece together a win this turn, has to give the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Deathrite Shaman and Zane with his bird. Both take it, and in his second main phase, Alex pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. He plays a Bayou for turn. With everyone running out of answers, Alex ships the turn to Zane. Before his untap, Zane's creatures fades in. He draws and then pays 2 life to activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Tenderwall. He fetches up a Spellskite onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Glenhorn and Alex with Malcolm. They both take it, and Malcolm triggers twice. Zane creates 2 treasures, and still in combat, Zane activates Glenhorn Buccaneer, discarding a card and drawing a card. Glenhorn triggers and deals 1 damage to each opponent. Malcolm triggers and Zane creates 3 treasures. He presents a loop of discarding and drawing cards through Glenhorn, creating treasures, and pinging his opponents down until they are dead, and Zane wins the game.
Dante was able to figure out whose line it is anyways, and gets to start us off. Dante draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Mana Crypt. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Karn, the Great Creator. The table sees that it's gonna be one of those games, and Karn resolves. With nothing else, Dante passes. Cal draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Arbor Elf. He passes. Chad draws and plays a mountain. He casts Faithless Looting. He draws 2 and discards 2. He ships the turn. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts Mana Vault. Alex gives the turn to Dante. During his upkeep, Dante wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a command tower. He casts an Arbor Elf of his own. He passes. Cal draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Cal ships the turn. Chad draws and plays a mountain. Being shut out by Karn, Chad passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts Phantasmal Image. It resolves and enters as a copy of Malcolm. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Dante loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He follows it up with a Rhystic Study. Sitting in a great position, Dante ends the turn. Cal draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps Mana Confluence to cast a Rhystic Study of his own. Rhystic triggers and Cal pays. Study resolves and Cal moves to combat. He attacks Karn with Malcolm. Karn takes the hit and Cal passes. Chad draws and plays a mountain. He casts Lava Dart, targeting Karn, paying for both Rhystic Studies. Dart deals 1 to Karn and Chad ends the turn. Alex draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Karn with Malcolm. Karn dies, and in his second main phase, Alex casts Scroll Rack. Both Rhystics trigger and Alex pays for Cal's Rhystic and Dante draws. He casts Mox Opal, paying for Cal's Rhystic and Dante draws. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Both Rhystics trigger and Alex doesn't pay for either. With nothing else, Alex gives the turn to Dante. During his upkeep, Dante loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Biomancer's Familiar. He plays a Prismatic Vista. He passes. Cal draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Dante with Malcolm. Dante takes the hit and Malcolm triggers. He creates a treasure and Cal ends the turn. Chad draws and plays a mountain. He casts Treasonous Ogre, not paying for either Rhystic. In response, Cal casts Pyroblast, targeting Dante's Rhystic Study. Rhystic triggers and Cal pays. In response, Dante activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Training Grounds into his hand. He taps his Ancient Tomb and activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Dispel into his hand. He cracks his Prismatic Vista, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts Dispel, targeting Pyroblast. Rhystic triggers and Cal draws. Pyroblast is countered, and with Ogre still on the stack, Cal taps his Mana Confluence to cast Mana Drain, targeting Ogre. Ogre is countered, and with nothing else, Chad ends his turn. During his draw step, Alex takes a damage from Mana Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Dante with Malcolm. Dante takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. He creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, Alex activates Scroll Rack. He exiles 4 cards from his hand, putting 4 cards from the top of his library into his hand, and rearranging the exiled cards on top of his library in any order. He plays a forest. He casts Mana Crypt. Both Rhystics trigger, and Alex doesn't pay for either. Alex ships the turn. During his upkeep, Dante wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and starts off his turn by casting Gilded Drake. Drake enters and targets Kinnan. In response, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 cards of his library and reveals Hullbreaker Horror, putting it onto the battlefield. Drake and Kinnan then exchange control, and Dante casts Finale of Devastation, where X is 3, not paying for Ristic. He fetches up a Tireless Provisioner onto the battlefield. He plays a Windswept Heath. Provisioner triggers, and Dante creates a treasure. He cracks his Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. Provisioner triggers and creates a treasure. He casts Training Grounds. Ristic triggers, and Cal draws. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Spellseeker. Ristic triggers, and Cal draws. Spellseeker enters, and Dante fetches up a Crop Rotation into his hand. He casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing a forest as an additional cost. Ristic triggers, and Cal draws. In response, Cal pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Crop Rotation. Ristic triggers, and Dante draws. In response, Dante casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card targeting Mental Misstep. Ristic triggers, and Dante pays. In response, Cal casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Crop Rotation. Ristic triggers, and Dante draws. In response, Dante activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Soul Ring into his hand. Flusterstorm counters Crop Rotation, and Force of Will counters Mental Misstep. With the stat clear, Dante casts Mox Diamond, not paying for Ristic. It enters, and he discards Urza's Saga. He casts Arcane Signet, not paying for Ristic. He casts Soul Ring, paying for Ristic. All finished up, Dante gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 4 colorless through Mana Drain. He plays a Misty Rainforest, he cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 3, paying for Ristic. In response, Dante activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Force of Vigor into his hand. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Scalding Tarn into play tapped. Tireless Provisioner triggers, and he creates a treasure. Dante then activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Force of Negation into his hand. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Mindbreak Trap into his hand. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Allosaurus Shepherd into his hand. Dante casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card targeting Finale of Devastation. In response, Cal casts Muddle the Mixture targeting Force of Negation, not paying for Ristic. In response, Dante casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card targeting Cal's Ristic Study and Scroll Rack. Ristic triggers, and Cal draws. Force destroys Cal's Ristic and Alex's Scroll Rack. Muddle then counters Force of Negation, and Finale resolves. Cal fetches up a Glinthorn Buccaneer onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Glinthorn, and Dante with Malcolm. They both take the hit, and Malcolm triggers. He creates 2 treasures, and in the end of combat step, Cal activates Glinthorn. He discards and draws a card. Glinthorn triggers, dealing 1 to each opponent. Malcolm triggers, creating 3 treasures. Cal then presents a loop of activating Glinthorn, dealing 1 to each opponent and creating 3 treasures. He does this over and over until the table is dead.
And Drake gets to start us off. Drake draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Mystic Remora. He passes. Philip draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. The table feels horrible deja vu, and Philip passes. Cal draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Tinderwall. Cal ships his turn. Dante draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. Dante casts Felwar Stone. Remora triggers, and Drake draws again. Dante casts a Mystic Remora of his own. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. With the fish properly satisfied, Dante ends his turn. During his upkeep, Drake taps his Mana Confluence to help pay for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Savannah. He passes the turn, discarding to hand size. Philip draws and plays a Mountain. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Ragavan. Drake takes it, and Ragavan triggers. Drake exiles Mana Vault from the top of his library, and Philip creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Philip casts Drake's Mana Vault from exile. Both Mystic Remoras trigger, and Drake and Dante draw. Philip casts his commander, Atsushi the Blazing Sky. He passes to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He sacrifices his Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. He gives the turn to Dante. During his upkeep, Dante pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. In response, Drake casts Enlightened Tutor. Mystic Remora triggers, and Dante draws. Drake then fetches up a Mana Crypt onto the top of his library. Malcolm resolves, and Dante ends his turn. During his upkeep, Drake taps his Mana Confluence to help pay for his Remora. He draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City. He casts a Mana Crypt. Mystic Remora triggers and Dante draws. He follows it up with a Soul Ring. Mystic Remora triggers and Dante draws. He sends the turn to Philip. During his draw step, Philip takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays an Inventor's Fair. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Ragavan. Drake takes it and Ragavan triggers. Drake exiles Serum Visions from the top of his library, and then Philip creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Philip casts Burgi, God of Storytelling. He passes. At the end of Philip's turn, Cal cracks his Misty Rainforest, paying a life. In response, Dante cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Then Cal fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. The turn moves to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Malcolm. Drake takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Sylvan Library. Mystic Remora triggers, and Drake and Dante draw. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Dante pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and he fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Esper Sentinel. Dante passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Drake wins his Mana Crypt roll. Also during his upkeep, he pays for his Remora. He draws and casts Chrome Mox. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Drake pays. Mystic Remora triggers, and Dante draws. Chrome Mox resolves, and Drake imprints Abundant Harvest. He casts his commander, Esika, God of the Tree. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. All through, he gives the turn to Philip. During his draw step, Philip takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Ragavan. Cal takes it, and Ragavan triggers. Cal exiles Boseiju, who endures from the top of his library, and Philip creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Philip plays a mountain. He casts Thrill of Possibility, discarding a card. Burgi triggers, adding a red. Remore triggers, and Drake and Dante draw. Esper triggers, and Dante draws again. He casts a Mana Crypt. Burgi triggers, adding a red. Remora triggers, and Drake and Dante draw. Philip casts Nim Deathmantle. Burgi triggers, adding a red. Remora triggers, and Drake and Dante draw. Set up to win his next turn, Philip passes to Cal. During his draw step, Cal draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays a Stomping Grounds into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Malcolm. Drake takes it, and Malcolm triggers. Cal creates a treasure, and then ships the turn to Dante. During his upkeep, Dante lets his Remora die. He draws and sacrifices Ranger Captain of Eos. In response, Philip casts Valakut Awakening. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Philip pays. Burgi triggers, and Philip adds a red. Valakut resolves, and Philip puts his hand onto the bottom of his library and draws that many +1. Still in response, Philip casts Cathartic Pyre, targeting Dante's Malcolm. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. Burgi triggers, and he adds a red. In response, Dante casts Swan Song, targeting Cathartic Pyre. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. In response, Drake casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Swansong. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Dante draws. In response, Dante casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Cathartic Pyre. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. In response, Cal casts Delay, targeting Force of Will. Remora triggers, and Drake draws again. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Cal pays. In response, Dante casts Mana Drain, targeting Deflecting Swat. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. With no other actions, the stack resolves. Mana Drain counters Deflecting Swat, Delay counters Force of Will, exiling with 3-time counters on it, Swan Song counters Cathartic Pile, Philip creates a 2/2 Swan token, and finally, Ranger Captain of Eos' ability resolves. Did you forget that was on the stack? Because we nearly did. Dante casts Mox Diamond. Mystic Remora triggers, and Drake draws. Diamond enters, and Dante discards Hallowed Fountain. Dante exiles Simian Spirit Guide, adding a red. He casts Gamble. Mystic Remora triggers, and Drake draws. Dante fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards Tandem Lookout. Dante taps his Sunbaked Canyon to help cast Glenhorn Buccaneer. Each of his opponents pass priority on the game-winning spell, and Glenhorn resolves. He moves to combat, attacking Malcolm at Drake and Glenhorn at Cal. They both take it, and Malcolm triggers, creating 2 treasures. Dante activates Glenhorn, discarding a card and pinging the table. Malcolm triggers, creating 3 treasures. Dante demonstrates a loop of activating Glenhorn, pinging the table, and creating treasures through Malcolm. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Dante wins the game. Cal was able to start the most Twitter drama over Double Masters 2 and gets to start us off. But Dante has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Spire of Industry. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Elvish Mystic. He ships the turn to Dante. Dante draws a card for turn and plays a Marsh Flats. He passes. Drake draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Marsh Flats. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He ends his turn. Philip draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Goblin Welder. He casts Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Goblin Engineer. It enters, and he fetches up a Nim Deathmantle into his graveyard. With an amazing turn 1 mono red start, Philip gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Dante casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. Still in Cal's end step, Dante casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Jeweled Lotus onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Dante. Dante draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his own Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He plays an Exotic Orchard. He ships the turn. Drake draws and plays a Boseiju, who endures. He casts his commander, Asika, God of the Tree. He ends his turn. Philip draws and plays an Inventor's Fair. He casts his commander, Atsushi, the Blazing Sky. He sends the turn to Cal. Cal draws and also plays a Boseiju, who endures. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Elvish Mystic as an additional cost. In response, Dante casts Intuition, targeting Drake. Dante fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer, Savine's Reclamation, and a Fierce Guardianship. Drake gives him Fierce Guardianship and the rest go to his graveyard. With Eldritch Evolution still on the stack, Dante casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Eldritch Evolution. In response, Cal casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Fierce. Swat resolves and changes the target of Fierce Guardianship to Deflecting Swat itself. Then Fierce Guardianship fizzles and Eldritch Evolution resolves. Cal fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer onto the battlefield. Cal moves to combat and swings Glenhorn at Dante and Malcolm at Drake. Both take it and Malcolm triggers, creating 2 treasures. Before the end of combat, Cal activates Glenhorn, discarding a card and pinging the table. Malcolm triggers, creating 3 treasures. Cal demonstrates a loop of discarding, pinging the table, creating a treasure through Malcolm, and drawing until his opponents are dead, and Cal wins the game. And Cal gets to start us off. Cal draws a card for turn and starts off by paying 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe. He looks at Zach's hand and draws a card. Cal casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Tandem Lookout. He plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. The table sighs as they feel major deja vu, and Cal passes the turn. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a mountain. He casts Lotus Petal. He follows up with a Mox Opal. He sacks his petal to help cast his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. The table realizes it's going to be another one of those games, and Ryan ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a forest. He casts Wild Growth and gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Narset's Reversal. Zach passes. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Malcolm. Ryan takes it and Malcolm triggers. Cal creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, he casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Mutavault. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Magda. Magda triggers and Ryan creates a treasure. Cal takes it, and in Ryan's second main phase, he casts Mana Vault. He casts Clock of Omens. In response, Zach taps his Spire of Industry to help cast Mana Drain, countering Clock of Omens. Ryan casts a Dwarven Trader and ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts Elvish Reclaimer. He follows up with a Jiraga Tree Speaker. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 4 colorless through Mana Drain. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He taps his Mana Confluence and Spire of Industry to help cast his commander, Narset, Enlightened Master. With a table on high alert, he passes the turn. Cal draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts Glenhorn Buccaneer. The table hopes that someone might have an answer, and with no such luck, Glenhorn resolves. Cal moves to combat and attacks Zach with Malcolm and Mike with Glenhorn. They take it, and Malcolm triggers, creating 2 treasures. Still in combat, Cal activates Glenhorn Buccaneer, discarding a card. Glenhorn triggers, deals a damage to each opponent, Malcolm triggers, creates 3 treasures, and then Cal draws a card. Using his treasures, he presents a loop, repeating this process until his opponents are dead. Cal flashed his Blockbuster card and gets to start us off. But Ryan has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Shinka, the Blood-Soaked Keep. Cal draws for turn and plays a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He plays a Breeding Pool into play tapped and passes the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He casts a Mana Crypt. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Zach casts Mox Opal and ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Ryan casts Dwarven Grunt. He passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Malcolm. Zeb takes a hit, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault and ends his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Zeb casts Entomb, fetching up an Esper Sentinel into his graveyard. Zeb draws and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. He casts Lurrus of the Dream Den. He casts Lotus Petal from his graveyard through Lurrus. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He casts Gravecrawler. He gives the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps his mana confluence to help cast Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and Zach creates 3 treasures. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts his commander, Elsha of the Infinite. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Zach passes the turn. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Dwarven Grunt. Magda triggers and Ryan creates a treasure. Cal takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Ryan casts Smuggler's Copter. He ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 3. In response, Zach casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Fierce Guardianship onto the top of his library. Zach casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost off of the top of his library through Elsha. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Fierce counters Invasion of Ikoria. Cal moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Malcolm. Zeb takes a hit, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. He gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and plays a Plains. He casts Esper Sentinel from his graveyard through Lurrus. He casts Smothering Tithe. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Lurrus. Cal takes the hit and Zeb gains 3 life. He ships the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, Smothering Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates a treasure. In his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Talisman of Progress, paying for Esper. He passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Ryan crews Smuggler's Copter with Magda. Magda triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and then moves to his turn. Ryan draws, casts Dwarven Miner, and gives the turn to Cal. During his draw step, Cal takes a damage through his mana vault and pays for Smothering Tithe. He casts Rhystic Study, and Zeb draws through Esper. In response, Zach casts Swan Song, targeting Rhystic Study, paying the Esper tax. Swan Song counters Study, and Cal creates a 2/2 bird. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Malcolm. Zeb takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. He ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Lurrus and Cal with Gravecrawler. They both take the hit, and Zeb gains 3 life. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and Zeb creates a treasure through Tithe. Still in his draw step, Zach pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probuff at the top of his library through Elsha. Esper triggers, and Zeb draws. Zach looks at Zeb's hand and draws a card. Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates another treasure. In his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Zach floats a mana and sacrifices it, fetching up Sensei's Divining Top onto the battlefield. He casts Gamble, triggering Lotho. In response, Zeb casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Elsha of the Infinite. Zach, looking for an answer, taps Talisman of Progress to help flash in a Dress Down off of the top of his library through Elsha. Holding priority, Zach activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Still holding priority, in response to his own Dress Down, Zach taps his mana confluence to help cast March of Swirling Mist, where X equals 1, targeting his own Elsha. March resolves, Elsha faces out, and Swords fizzles. With Dress Down still in the stack, Ryan crews Smuggler's Copter with his 3 creatures. Magda triggers, and Ryan creates 3 treasures. Dress Down enters, Zach draws a card, and Zeb creates a treasure through Tithe. Lotho's trigger resolves, Zeb loses a life and creates another treasure. Gamble finally resolves, and Zach fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Swords to Plowshares. With the stack clear, Zach plays a Fiery Island. With nothing else, Zach passes, and Dress Down is sacrificed. Ryan draws, and Zeb creates a treasure through Tithe. He plays a Mutavault for turn. Ryan crews the Smuggler's Copter with Dwarven Grunt and Magda. Magda triggers twice, and Ryan creates 2 more treasures. He activates Magda by sacrificing 5 treasures. He fetches up a God Pharaoh statue onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Smuggler's Copter. Copter triggers, and Ryan draws and discards, paying for Smothering Tithe. Zeb takes the hit, and Ryan passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, God Pharaoh statue triggers, and each of Ryan's opponents lose a life. During Cal's draw step, he takes a damage through Mana Vault and pays for Smothering Tithe. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Malcolm and his bird. Ryan takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts a Mana Crypt. Esper triggers, and Zeb draws. Cal ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Lurrus and Gravecrawler. Zach takes the hit, and Zeb gains 3 life. In his second main phase, he casts Lotus Petal from his graveyard through Lurrus. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He passes the turn. At the end of Zeb's turn, Zach taps his Fiery Islet to activate his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Before Zach's untapped, Elsha phases back in. During his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates a treasure. He plays a Gemstone Caverns and then ships the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Ryan crews Smuggler's Copter with Dwarven Miner. Magda triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and then moves to his turn. Ryan draws, Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates a treasure. He plays a mountain for turn. He casts Metallic Mimic, choosing Dwarf as it enters. He crews Smuggler's Copter with his 4 dwarves. Magda triggers 4 times, and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures. In response, Zach casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Metallic Mimic, paying the Esper tax. Mimic bounces, and then Magda's ability resolves. Ryan fetches up a Sphere of Resistance onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Smuggler's Copter. Copter triggers, Ryan draws and discards. Tide triggers, and Zeb creates another treasure. Zeb takes it, Ryan moves to his end step, Pharaoh statue triggers, and each of Ryan's opponents lose a life. The turn moves to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his mana vault and then pays for Smothering Tithe. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Malcolm and his 2/2 bird. Ryan takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. He gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Lurrus and Cal with Gravecrawler. They both take it, and Zeb gains 3 life. In his second main phase, he casts Ad Nauseam. In response, Cal casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card targeting Ad Nauseam. Esper triggers and Zeb draws. Then Force counters Naws. Next, Zeb casts a Mana Crypt. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, Zach taps his Fiery Islet to activate his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and Zeb creates a treasure through Tithe. In his main phase, Zach casts Rolling Earthquake where X equals 2. Elsha's Prowess triggers and gains +1/+1 until the end of turn. Earthquake resolves, dealing 2 damage to each creature and each player, wiping nearly all of the board. Zach moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Elsha. Ryan takes the hit, and Zach ships the turn. Ryan draws, and Zeb creates a treasure through Tithe. He casts Metallic Mimic, naming Dwarf as it enters. He passes, God Pharaoh statue triggers, and Ryan's opponents lose a life. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault and pays for Smothering Tithe. He takes no actions and gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and recasts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. He casts Phyrexian Altar. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and Zeb creates a treasure through Tithe. He casts Helm of Awakening. Elsha's Prowess triggers, getting +1/+1. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Elsha. Ryan takes the hit and Zach passes the turn. Ryan draws, Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates a treasure. In his main phase, he casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Utvara Hellkite. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Dockside enters, and in response, Zach activates his top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Then Ryan makes it rain as he creates 18 treasures. He recasts his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures. He fetches up a Clock of Omens onto the battlefield. He activates Clock, tapping it and Metallic Mimic to untap Metallic Mimic. Magda triggers, and in response, Zeb casts Vanishing Verse, targeting Magda. Ryan reveals the last card in his hand and casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Vanishing Verse. Swat resolves, and Ryan changes the target of Verse to Smothering Tithe. In response, Zeb casts Rebuff the Wicked, countering Vanishing Verse. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Magda's trigger resolves, and Ryan creates a treasure token. Ryan presents a loop of activating Clock of Omens, tapping Metallic Mimic and a treasure token to untap Metallic Mimic and create a treasure through Magda. He repeats this process, creating infinite tapped treasures. He activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures, fetching up a defense grid onto the battlefield. He activates Magda again and fetches up a Maskwood Nexus onto the battlefield. He activates Magda and fetches up Zorn onto the battlefield. He repeats the Clock of Omens loop, but this time, with Zorn in play, he creates infinite tapped and untapped treasures as well. He activates Magda, fetching up Slowbad, Goblin Tinkerer onto the battlefield. He activates Magda, fetching up an Elixir of Immortality onto the battlefield. He activates Magda and fetches up a Spine of Ish-Sa onto the battlefield. Spine enters and Ryan destroys an opponent's permanent. He sacrifices Spine of Ish-Sa to Slowbad. Spine triggers and returns to Ryan's hand. He presents a loop of casting Spine of Ish-Sa, destroying a permanent, sacking it to Slowbad, returning it to his hand, and casting it again. He repeats this loop until all of his opponent's permanents are destroyed. He activates Magda and fetches up a Pyrite Spellbomb onto the battlefield. He sacrifices it to deal 2 damage to one of his opponents. He activates Elixir of Immortality, gains 5 life, and shuffles it and his graveyard into his library. He presents a loop of activating Magda to fetch up Elixir and Spellbomb onto the battlefield, sacking Spellbomb to deal 2 damage, then shuffling them both back into his library with Elixir. He repeats this process over and over until his opponents are dead, and Ryan wins the game. Peter had the coolest sleeves at the table, so he gets to start us off. Peter draws a card for turn and plays a Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Off to a good start, he ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mox Amber. He gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He casts Mox Amber. He passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Crystal Vein. He pays 2 life to help cast Buried Alive. Kirik triggers, and in response, Alex casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing his tropical island, countering Buried Alive. Then Kirik gets a +1/+1 counter, and Peter moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Kirik. Alex takes the hit, Peter gains 3, and ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Ragavan. Peter takes it, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm, then another through Ragavan, and then Peter exiles Chain of Smog. With one combo piece removed, Cal passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Eldritch Evolution. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2, targeting Peter. Invasion of Ikoria enters, and Sean fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters, and in response, Cal sacks his 2 treasures. Then Sean creates 2 of his own. He sacrifices his treasures and his Chrome Mox as an additional cost to help cast his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. All through, he ships the turn. Alex draws and plays a tropical island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, and then passes the turn. Peter draws, plays a swamp, and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm and Alex with Ragavan. They both take the damage, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Cal creates 2 treasures through Malcolm, then another through Ragavan, and then Alex exiles Basalt Monolith. Cal lets out a series of hoots with another combo piece removed, and he moves to his second main phase. He casts a Spellskite. He passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dargo. Peter takes the hit, and Sean ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. He casts Glenelendra Archmage. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Pact of Negation into his hand. Glenelendra resolves, and Alex passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Lotus Petal, paying the Rhystic tax. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm and Alex with Ragavan. Alex blocks Ragavan with Glenelendra. Peter takes the hit, Glenelendra and Ragavan trade, then Malcolm and Glenelendra trigger. Alex returns Glenelendra to the battlefield through Persist, and Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm. Cal, having nothing better to do, thinks about casting Tana, but decides to pass the turn. Sean draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dargo. In response, Peter casts Saw in Half, targeting Dargo, and Alex draws through Rhystic. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Then Saw in Half resolves, destroying Dargo, and Sean creates 2 miniaturized Dargo tokens, sacking 1 to the legendary rule. All through, Sean ships this wreck to Alex. Alex draws, plays an island, and passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws, takes no actions, and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm. Peter takes the hit, Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm, and then he passes his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a City of Brass onto the battlefield tapped. Sean draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, he ends his turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, but fails to find. Alex draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He casts a Lotus Petal. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Phantasmal Image onto the battlefield. Phantasmal Image enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside triggers, and in response, Peter sacrifices his Lotus Petal, and Cal sacrifices his 5 treasures. Then Alex creates 4 treasures through Dockside. Alex casts Wandering Archaic. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor, paying the Rhystic tax. Kirik triggers and gains a counter. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Dispel into his hand. Sean then casts Dispel, countering Vampiric Tutor, and Alex draws through Rhystic. With Archaic still in the stack, Sean puts on his Table Police badge and casts Pact of Negation, targeting Wandering Archaic. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. In response, Alex taps Waterlogged Grove to help cast Crop Rotation, sacrificing Grove as an additional cost, fetching up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. Then Pact resolves, countering Wandering Archaic. Alex activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts a Consecrated Sphinx onto the battlefield. Sitting pretty, he ships the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Cal casts Veil of Summer, paying for Rhystic. Cal draws a card, then Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx, and then they move to Peter's turn. Peter draws, and Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. He does nothing else and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws, and Alex draws 2 through Sphinx. Cal moves to combat and attacks Sean with Malcolm. Sean takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts Corridor Monitor, paying for Rhystic. In response, Peter sacrifices his Crystal Vein to hard cast Snuff Out, targeting Consecrated Sphinx, paying the Rhystic tax. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Alex, not wanting to lose his Golden Goose, casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Snuff Out. In response, Sean taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to help activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Swan Song into his hand. Sphinx triggers and Alex draws 2. In response to Fierce Guardianship, Cal casts Spell Pierce, targeting Fierce. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Then Spell Pierce counters Fierce, Snuff Out destroys Consecrated Sphinx, and Corridor Monitor resolves. Monitor enters and Cal untaps his Sol Ring. All through, Cal passes the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He sacrifices his Dargo token, Thrasios, Mox Amber, and Sol Ring as an additional cost and recasts his commander, Dargo. Ristic triggers and Alex draws. Sean casts Life's Legacy, sacrificing Dargo as an additional cost. Ristic triggers and Alex draws again. In response, Alex sacrifices Glenalindra, countering Life's Legacy. Sean, not wanting Dargo's cost reduction to go to waste, again casts Dargo the Shipwrecker, and Alex draws through Ristic. He gives the turn to Alex. During Alex's upkeep, Cal casts March of Swirling Mist where X equals 1, targeting Kinnan, paying the Ristic tax. In response, Alex activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Jin-Gitaxias, Progress Tyrant, onto the battlefield. March resolves, and Kinnan phases out. Alex draws for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts Lawan, Cephalid Empress. Empress enters, bouncing Malcolm and Corridor Monitor back to Kyle's hand. Alex passes, discarding to hand size. Peter draws, takes no actions, and ships the turn. Cal draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Alex. Jin-Gitaxias, Ristic, and Mystic all trigger. Alex draws through Mystic and Ristic, then Jin-Gitaxias counters Gitaxian Probe. Cal, getting ready to be roasted in the comments, gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and moves to combat. He attacks the invasion of Ikoria with Dargo. He defeats it, the invasion is exiled, and then Sean casts the backside, Zilortha, Apex of Ikoria, paying for Ristic. He passes the turn to Alex. Before Alex is untapped, Kinnan phases back in. During his upkeep, he pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Nykthos, adding 7 blue. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 10. Jin-Gitaxias triggers and creates a copy of Finale. In response, Sean casts Swansong, targeting the original Finale of Devastation. Jin-Gitaxias, Ristic, and Mystic all trigger. Alex draws through Mystic, Sean pays for Ristic, and Jin-Gitaxias counters Swansong. Sean then taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to help hardcast Mindbreak Trap, targeting both Finales. Ristic and Mystic both trigger, and Alex draws. In response, Alex casts Delay, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Cal, wanting to make up for his previous play, casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Delay, paying for Ristic. Mystic triggers and Alex draws. Alex refuses the offer and pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting an Offer You Can't Refuse. The table, out of answers, resigns to their fate. Misstep counters Offer, Delay counters and suspends Mindbreak Trap with 3 time counters, then the first copy of Finale of Devastation resolves. Alex fetches up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the battlefield. The original Finale resolves, and he fetches up a Deadeye Navigator onto the battlefield. Deadeye enters and soul bonds with Phantasmal Image. Alex presents a loop of activating Phantasmal Image's new ability to exile it, return to the battlefield as a Dockside Extortionist, create 2 treasures, then crack a treasure to create 2 mana through Kinnan to again blink Phantasmal Image. He does this until he has infinite treasures. Alex then activates Kinnan until he puts Thrasios Triton Hero onto the battlefield. He uses his infinite treasures to draw his deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alex wins the game. Cal won the game of musical chairs and gets to start us off. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends the turn. Mike draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Cal. He looks at Cal's hand and draws a card. He plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 2 life as an additional cost. Cal wonders what in the world Mike is doing, and Malcolm dies. Mike laughs and passes the turn. Phil draws and plays a Plains. He casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. He passes to Caleb. Caleb draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices the Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Savala, Heart of the Wilds. He ends his turn. During Cal's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He ends the turn. Phil draws and plays a Battlefield Forge. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps Battlefield Forge to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Alseid. Winota triggers, Phil looks at the top 6 and puts Thalia's Lancers onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. Lancers enters and Phil fetches up a Squee, Dubious Monarch, into his hand. They all take it and Phil passes the turn. Caleb draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Teamer Sabertooth. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays an Ottawara, Soin City as his land for turn. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He recasts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends his turn. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Timna. Cal takes it and Mike gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Timna. He plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ad Nauseam. With no answers, Ad Naus resolves. He reveals an opposition agent, Wheel of Fortune, Ancient Tomb, Demonic Consultation, Gemstone Caverns, City of Brass, Lavinia Azorius Renegade, Swansong, Savine's Reclamation, Demonic Tutor, Underground Sea, Force of Will, Thassa's Oracle, Ottawara Soaring City, Gamble, Jeweled Lotus, Brain Freeze, Final Fortune, Swords to Plowshares, Mnemonic Betrayal, Polluted Delta, Forbidden Orchard, Mystic Remora, and a Mindbreak Trap, killing him. The turn moves to Phil. During his upkeep, Phil wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Squee, Dubious Monarch. He casts a Ginger Brute. He moves to combat and attacks Cow with everything. Winota triggers 3 times and Squee triggers. Phil creates a 1/1 Goblin token tapped and attacking Cow. Then Phil looks at the top 6 and puts Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Cow. He looks at the next 6, putting Ethersworn Canonist onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. He looks at the next 6 one last time and puts Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Cal. Recruiter of the Guard triggers and Phil fetches up a Solitude into his hand. With no blocks, Caleb takes 4 and Cal takes 32. Phil passes the turn to Caleb. Caleb draws and casts Rishkar's Expertise. He draws 4 cards, but cannot cast anything for free due to Ethersworn Canonist. He moves to combat and attacks Phil with Temur Sabertooth. Phil declares no blocks and takes it. Caleb passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt flip, takes 3 damage, and dies. During his upkeep, Phil wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and moves directly to combat. He attacks Caleb with everything. Winota triggers 4 times and Squee triggers. Phil creates a 1/1 Goblin token, tapped and attacking Caleb. Then Phil looks at the top 6 and puts a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. He looks at the next 6 and puts a Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. He looks at the next 6 and puts Mother of Runes onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. He then looks at the last 6 and fails to find. Then Caleb takes 48 damage, dies, and Phil wins the game. And Cal gets to start us off. But Lua and Ian have pregame actions. Lua puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Vryn Wingmare. Ian also puts the Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Windswept Teeth. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Elvish Mystic. He passes the turn. Lua draws and plays an Arid Mesa. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. She casts a Drannith Magistrate. She gives the turn to Brian. Brian draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He ships the turn. Ian draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Mystic Remora. He ends his turn. Cal draws, plays a Windswept Teeth, and passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Brian cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Lua draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. She casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. She cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. She casts Skrelv, Deflector Might. She moves to combat and attacks Brian with Drannith. Brian takes it, and Lua passes. Brian draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He gives the turn to Ian. During his upkeep, Ian pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Talisman of Curiosity. He casts Mox Opal. Ian passes. At the end of Ian's turn, Cal cracks his Windswept Teeth, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield tapped. Cal draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Vexing Shusher. He ships the turn to Lua. Lua draws and plays a Shatter Skull, the Hammer Pass, into play untapped, paying 3 life. She casts her commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. In response, Brian casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Winota. Mystic Remora triggers and Ian draws. Force of Will resolves, countering Winota. Lua moves to combat and attacks Brian with Spirit of the Labyrinth and Drannith. Brian takes the hit, and Lua ends the turn. Brian draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Talisman of Dominance, and Ian draws through Remora. He casts an Arcane Signet, and Ian draws again. Brian passes to Ian. During his upkeep, Ian lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Consecrated Sphinx. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and Consecrated Sphinx triggers. Ian draws 1 due to Spirit of the Labyrinth. Cal does nothing else and ends the turn. Lua draws, Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1 due to Spirit. Lua plays a City of Brass and moves to combat. She attacks Brian with Drannith and the Spirit. Brian takes it, and Lua passes. Brian draws, Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Plateau. He casts a Grim Monolith. He ships the turn to Ian. During his draw step, Ian takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He moves to combat, attacking Lua with Consecrated Sphinx. Lua takes it, and in his second main phase, Ian casts Wandering Archaic. In response, Brian casts Ad Nauseam. In response, Cal casts Swansong, targeting Ad Nauseam. Ad Nauseam is countered, and Brian creates a 2/2 bird. Wandering Archaic resolves, and Ian passes the turn. At the end of Ian's turn, Cal casts Worldly Tutor. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Cal taps Ancient Tomb to pay for it. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Cal fetches up a Spellseeker onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Cal. Cal draws, Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. He takes no other actions and passes to Lua. Lua draws, Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. She plays a Windswept Heath for turn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. She recasts her commander, Winota. She moves to combat and attacks Brian with everything. Winota triggers twice. Lua looks at the top 6, putting Angrath's Marauders onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. She looks at the next 6, putting Imperial Recruiter onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. Imperial Recruiter triggers, and Lua fetches up a Rograk, Son of Rogaw, into her hand. Brian blocks the Spirit with his bird, and Ian blocks Imperial Recruiter with Wandering Archaic. Spirit dies, and then they both take the rest. In her second main phase, she casts Rograk. She ends her turn. Brian draws, and since Spirit of the Labyrinth is no longer on the battlefield, Ian draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. He does nothing else and passes. At the end of Brian's turn, Ian casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He then casts a Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the top of his library. Brian gives the turn to Ian. Ian draws and casts Hullbreaker Horror. He plays a Gaia's Cradle and then taps it for 3 green. He casts a Spellskite. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Ian returns Mox Opal to his hand. He casts Mox Opal, returning Mana Vault to his hand. He demonstrates a loop by casting and bouncing Mox Opal and Mana Vault, producing infinite mana of all colors. He ends the loop by bouncing Draneth Magistrate. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He activates Kinnan an infinite number of times, putting all of his non-humans onto the battlefield, including Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios, drawing his deck and putting all of his lands onto the battlefield tapped. He then casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 69,420, pumping all of his creatures, giving them haste, and then moving to combat. He attacks with everything, and Ian wins the game. Ryan wins the Doja Cat cosplay pageant and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Godless Shrine into play tapped. He passes. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Gamble. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Cal ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Manifold Key. He casts Mask of Memory. He activates Manifold Key, untapping his Mana Vault. He casts Thorn of Amethyst. The table sits there shocked at Charles' turn 1 play, and he gives the turn to Garner. Garner draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Enslaved Dwarf. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Dothy Voidwalker. He ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Taiga. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Malcolm. Ryan takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts Ledger Shredder. He casts Elvish Mystic. Ledger Shredder triggers, Cal connives, discarding Red Elemental Blast into exile with a Void counter through Dothy Voidwalker. Ledger Shredder gets the +1/+1 counter, and then Elvish Mystic resolves. Finished up, Cal passes. During his draw step, Charles takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Aganja, Seed of the Empire. He casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. He activates Manifold Key, untapping his Mana Vault. He casts his commander, Heliod, Suncrown. Ledger Shredder triggers and Cal connives Arid Mesa into exile through Dothy. Charles equips Mask of Memory to Alseid and passes to Garner. Garner draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Dockside Extortionist. The table sinks their head in despair, and Dockside resolves. Dockside triggers, and in response, Cal cracks his treasure and adds a red. Then Garner creates 8 treasures. He casts his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. Ledger Shredder triggers, and Cal connives Veil of Summer into exile through Dothy, putting a counter on Ledger Shredder. Then Magda resolves. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Enslaved Dwarf. Magda triggers, and Garner creates a treasure. Ryan takes it, and in his second main phase, Garner activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures. He fetches up a Cursed Mirror onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 8 more treasures. He activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures, fetching up a Universal Automaton onto the battlefield. He activates Magda again, fetching up Clock of Omens onto the battlefield. He activates Clock of Omens, tapping Universal Automaton and Clock of Omens itself, targeting Universal Automaton. Since Automaton is a changeling, and therefore a dwarf, Magda triggers and creates a treasure. Then Clock's ability resolves and Automaton untaps. He activates Clock again, this time using his newly created treasure and Automaton to untap Automaton. He presents a loop of tapping his treasures and Automaton to activate Clock, untapping Automaton, creating more and more treasures each time. Using this loop, he creates infinite tapped treasures. He activates Magda, sacrificing treasures and fetching up a Maskwood Nexus onto the battlefield, giving all of the creatures in his deck all creature types. He activates Magda, sacrificing treasures and fetching up Zorn onto the battlefield, since Zorn is now a dragon through Maskwood. He presents the same loop as before, creating infinite tapped and untapped treasures through Zorn. He activates Magda, sacrificing treasures and fetches up a Spine of Ish-Sa onto the battlefield. It enters and destroys Thorn of Amethyst. He activates Magda, sacrificing treasures and fetches up a Bogarden Hellkite onto the battlefield. It enters and kills Dothy Voidwalker, Malcolm, and Elvish Mystic. He activates Magda, sacrificing treasures and fetches up a Soul Guide Lantern onto the battlefield. It enters and exiles Dothy Voidwalker from Ryan's graveyard. Garner activates Magda, sacrificing treasures, and fetches up an Elixir of Immortality onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Soul Guide Lantern to draw a card. He activates Elixir of Immortality, shuffling it and his graveyard into his library, gaining 5 life. He now presents a loop of fetching both Soul Guide Lantern and Elixir through Magda, drawing a card through Lantern, shuffling it in through Elixir, and then fetching them up again. Using this loop, he can start drawing the cards in his deck. He draws until he finds Lightning Bolt. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Ryan. He then shuffles Lightning Bolt into his deck through his Lantern Elixir loop. He uses this loop of drawing Lightning Bolt, casting it, and shuffling it over and over again. He does this repeatedly until the table is dead, and Garner wins the game. And Cal gets to start us off. Cal draws and casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Neo form. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts a turn 1, Mystic Remora. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Professional Facebreaker. The table sides at this amazing turn 1 play, and Cal passes the turn. Charles draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Arcane Signet. Remora triggers and Cal draws. Charles ends his turn. Garner draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Dwarven Grunt. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Remora triggers and Cal draws. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. Garner ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Cal draws. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Cal lets his Remora die, seeing as it, drew him 3 cards. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Professional Facebreaker. Ryan takes it, Facebreaker triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Spellskite. Cal gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Karn, the Great Creator. The table sighs, and Karn resolves. Charles activates Karn's first ability, turning Cal's Chrome Mox into a creature, killing it. Charles ends his turn. Garner draws and plays a Mutavault. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Magda and Dwarven Grunt. Magda triggers twice and creates 2 treasures. Ryan takes it, and Garner passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts Dauthi Voidwalker. Ryan passes. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Karn with Facebreaker and Ryan with Malcolm. Karn and Ryan take it, Malcolm and Facebreaker trigger, and Cal creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Cal activates Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure and exiling Muddle the Mixture off of the top of his library. He activates Facebreaker again, exiling Jeweled Lotus. He casts Jeweled Lotus from exile. Finished up, Cal ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He activates Karn's first ability, targeting Garner's treasure, killing it. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Owl, the Dawn Sky. Charles passes to Garner. At the end of Charles' turn, Garner flashes in High-Speed Hoverbike. It enters and taps down Charles' AO. The turn moves to Garner. Garner draws and casts Bloodfire Dwarf. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Magda and Dwarven Grunt. Magda triggers and creates 2 treasures. Ryan takes it and Garner passes the turn. Ryan draws and casts a Mox Opal. He passes. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Karn with Facebreaker and Ryan with Malcolm. Ryan and Karn take it, Malcolm and Facebreaker trigger, and Cal creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Cal activates Facebreaker twice, sacrificing his treasures. He exiles Toski, Bearer of Secrets, and exiles Arid Mesa. He plays an Arid Mesa from exile. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. All finished up, Cal passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He activates Karn's first ability, targeting Garner's treasure, killing it. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Uwu. Ryan takes it, and Charles passes the turn. Garner draws and activates Mutavault, turning it into a creature. He taps it for mana, triggering Magda, creating a treasure. He casts a Soul Ring. Garner moves to combat. He declares he intends to attack Ryan and Cal with his creatures. Ryan implores with the table that they really need to get Karn off of the battlefield since it's stopping everyone's strategy. No one else wants to attack Karn since it frees everyone else up to immediately attempt to win. So instead, they want to wait until the opportune time. Ryan attempts to reason with them that Charles will run away with the game if they take that approach. Unfortunately, no one agrees with Ryan, and Garner attacks Cal with Dwarven Grunt and Bloodfire Dwarf, and Ryan with Magda. Magda triggers and creates 3 treasures. Cal blocks Bloodfire Dwarf with Spellskite, and they all take the rest. Finished up, Garner passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Karn with Dauthi Voidwalker. Karn takes it, and in his second main phase, Ryan casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Ryan passes. Cal draws and plays a Taiga. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Facebreaker and Garner with Malcolm. Both take it, Malcolm and Facebreaker trigger, and Cal creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Cal pays 2 life and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Birthing Pod. Cal ends his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Charles casts Enlightened Tuner, fetching up a Grasp of Fate onto the top of his library. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Grasp of Fate. It enters and targets Magda, Dauthi, and Malcolm. In response, Garner activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures, and fetches up an Ancient Copper Dragon onto the battlefield. Then the 3 are exiled, with Malcolm and Magda moving to the command zone. Next, Charles casts Ashnod's Altar. Everyone suddenly realizes that they are in big trouble, and Altar resolves. Charles sacrifices Owl to Altar, moving it to the command zone, adding 2 colorless. AO triggers, Charles looks at the top 7 and puts Ranger Captain Avios and Claws of Gix onto the battlefield. Ranger Captain triggers, and Charles fetches up Serra Ascendant into his hand. He casts Serra Ascendant. He activates Karn's first ability, targeting Cal's Jeweled Lotus, killing it. Finished up, Charles passes. Garner draws and casts a Lotus Petal. He moves to combat, Ryan pleased with the table again about Karn, and Garner declares his attacks. He attacks Ryan with Dwarven Grunt and Cal with Ancient Copper Dragon. Ryan sighs, they both take it, and Copper Dragon triggers. Garner rolls a 13 and creates 13 treasures. All through, Garner gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts an Arcane Signet. He passes. Cal draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast his commander, Malcolm. Cal ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He activates Karn's first ability, targeting his own Arcane Signet. He taps it for white, then sacks it to Ashnod's, adding 2 colorless. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast his commander, Ao. He sacrifices it to Ashnod's, moving to the command zone. Owl triggers, Charles looks at the top 7, putting Stoneforge Mystic and Bounty Agent onto the battlefield. Stoneforge triggers, and Charles fetches up a Nim Death Mantle into his hand. Next, Charles sacrifices Stoneforge Mystic to Ashnod's and casts Nim Death Mantle. He sacrifices Serra Ascendant, Bounty Agent, and Ranger Captain to Ashnod's and recasts his commander, Ao. He sacrifices Uwu to Ashnod's, Nim Death Mantle, and Owl trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Land Tax and Archon of Emeria onto the battlefield. He then sacrifices Archon to Ashnod's and uses it to pay for Death Mantle's trigger, returning Ao to the battlefield. He sacks Uwu to Ashnod's again, Death Mantle, and Owl trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Jeweled Lotus, Grand Abolisher, and Phyrexian Revoker onto the battlefield. When Revoker enters, Charles names Professional Facebreaker. He then sacrifices the Revoker to Ashnod's, pays for Death Mantle, returning Owl to the battlefield. He sacrifices Ao to Ashnod's, Death Mantle, and Owl trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Spirit of the Labyrinth, Leonin Relic Warder, and Lion's Eye Diamond onto the battlefield. Relic Warder triggers, targeting Cal's Birthing Pod. Charles holds priority and sacrifices Relic Warder to Ashnod's, adding 2 colorless. Relic triggers again, returns nothing, then its original ETB resolves and permanently exiles Cal's Birthing Pod. Then Charles pays for Death Mantle and returns Owl to the battlefield. He sacks Owl to Ashnod's yet again, Death Mantle and AO trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Mox Opal, Soul Ring, Portable Hull, and Weathered Wayfarer onto the battlefield, and then Mox Diamond into the graveyard since he didn't discard a land. Portable Hull enters and exiles Ryan's Lion's Eye Diamond. Charles then taps his Soul Ring to pay for Death Mantle, returning Uwu to the battlefield. He sacrifices Owl to Ashnod's, Death Mantle, and AO trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Ethersworn Canoness and Sanctifier and Vec onto the battlefield. Sanctifier enters and exiles all black and red cards from graveyards. Charles then sacrifices Sanctifier to Ashnod's, paying for Death Mantle, returning Owl to the battlefield. He ends his turn. Just kidding, he sacrifices Owl to Ashnod's, Death Mantle, and AO trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Midnight, Cathar Commando, and Grim Monolith onto the battlefield. He taps his Monolith to help pay for Death Mantle, returning Owl to the battlefield. He sacrifices AO to Ashnod's, Death Mantle, and Uwu trigger. Charles looks at the top 7, putting Enduring Renewal and Mana Crypt onto the battlefield. He taps his Crypt to pay for Death Mantle, returning Owl to the battlefield. Now with the pieces on the battlefield, Charles presents a loop. He sacrifices Memnite to Ashnod's, adding 2 colorless. Enduring Renewal triggers, and Charles returns Memnite to his hand. He recasts Memnite for 0. He repeats this loop over and over again, netting infinite colorless mana. With infinite mana, he can continually sacrifice and return Owl to the battlefield, digging through his entire deck. He can then put every non-land permanent with mana value 4 or less onto the battlefield. Through one of his AO loops, he puts Walking Ballista onto the battlefield. It enters as a 0/0 and dies immediately. Enduring Renewal triggers, and Charles returns it to his hand. He then uses his infinite mana to help cast Walking Ballista, where X equals 69,420. He activates Walking Ballista, machine guns the entire table, and Charles wins the game. Brandon wins the Underwater Basket Weaving Challenge and gets to start us off. But Cal has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Tinderwall. Brandon draws a card for turn and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps it to help cast a Hardened Scales. He passes. Spencer draws a card for turn and plays a Tundra. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Ishai, Ujatai Dragonspeaker. Set up with the turn 1 bird players dream of, Spencer passes. Mark draws and plays a Steam Fence, and to play untapped, paying 2 life. He apologizes to the table for what he's about to do, and everyone scratches their heads. He casts Paradise Mantle. Ishai triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Rogah. Ishai triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. He casts Springleaf Drum. Ishai triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. He taps his Rograk to help activate Springleaf Drum. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand to help cast Arcane Signet. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. The table begs him to stop, and he decides he's done enough. He equips Paradise Mantle to Rograk. He ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Staring down a massive bird already, Cal holds up mana and passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Cavern of Souls. It enters and he names Illusion. Taking a page from Cal's book and equally scared of Ishai, Brandon gives the turn to Spencer. Spencer draws and plays a Steam Fence into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He moves to combat and decides to thank Mark for his generosity by attacking Mark with Ishai. Mark takes it, and Spencer passes. Mark draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He taps his commander with Paradise Mantle to help cast Wheel of Misfortune. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. Everyone secretly picks a number and then reveals them at the same time. Mark chooses 11, Cal chooses 8, Brandon chooses 5, and Spencer chooses 4. Everyone but Spencer wheels, and then Mark takes 11 damage. Mark passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. He passes. Brandon draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. He cracks it and taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast an uncounterable, toothy, imaginary friend. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. All finished up, Brandon gives the turn over to Spencer. Spencer draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters and he fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Mark with Ishai. Mark declares no blocks and takes it all. With Mark's life total in the ropes already, Spencer passes the turn. Mark draws and plays an Underground River. He casts Necropotence. He pays 7 life through Necropotence, exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the exiled cards into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Cal draws and casts Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Malcolm. Brandon takes it and Malcolm and Facebreaker trigger. Cal creates 2 treasures and then passes the turn. Brandon draws and Toothy triggers, getting 2 +1/+1 counters through Hardened Scales. He taps his Waterlogged Grove to help cast Sylvan Library. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. He ships the turn. Spencer draws and plays an island. He casts Esper Sentinel. He moves to combat and attacks Mark with Ranger Captain of Eos and Brandon with Ishai. Both take it, and in his second main phase, Spencer casts Talisman of Creativity. He passes. Mark skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he casts Dockside Extortionist. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. Dockside enters and he creates 6 treasures. He casts Rhystic Study. Ishai and Esper Sentinel trigger. Spencer draws and Ishai grows. Mark casts Void Snare, targeting Ishai. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. In response to Void Snare, Spencer casts Pyroblast, targeting Void Snare. Rhystic triggers and Mark draws. In response, Mark casts Spell Pierce, targeting Pyroblast. Ishai triggers and gets a counter. In response, Spencer casts Brainstorm. Rhystic triggers and Mark draws. Brainstorm resolves and Spencer draws 3 and then puts 2 back on top. Unfortunately, Spencer could not find an answer and Spell Pierce resolves, countering Pyroblast. Then Void Snare resolves, bouncing Ishai. Mark casts Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Spencer sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos, stopping his opponents from casting non-creature spells for the rest of the turn. Consultation resolves and he names Deadly Rollick. He exiles until he finds Deadly Rollick, including his Thassa's Oracle, and Peer into the Abyss. He puts Deadly Rollick into his hand and passes the turn. Cal draws and casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Gamble. Esper Sentinel and Rhystic trigger. Cal pays for Esper and Mark draws. Cal casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Professional Facebreaker. Rhystic triggers and Mark draws. In response, Mark casts Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Malcolm. Esper Sentinel triggers and Spencer draws. In response, Cal casts Dispel, targeting Deadly Rollick, countering it. Then Eldritch Evolution fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer onto the battlefield. Cal moves to combat and swings Glenhorn at Mark and Malcolm at Spencer. Mark blocks Glenhorn with Rograk and Spencer takes it. Malcolm triggers and creates a treasure. Still in combat, he activates Glenhorn Buccaneer. Cal presents a loop of activating Glenhorn, looting, damaging his opponents, and creating treasures through Malcolm. Cal repeats this process until Brandon and Mark are dead. Unfortunately, because Brandon and Mark's low life totals, Cal cannot create enough treasures to also kill Spencer. All said and done, Spencer takes 24 damage and Cal loots 24 times. On its final iteration, Cal is left with 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Cal plays a command tower. He casts Spellseeker. It enters and he fetches up a Twin Flame into his hand. He passes. Spencer draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He also casts Spellseeker. It enters and he fetches up a Swords to Plowshares into his hand. Spencer gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Spencer with Malcolm, Glenhorn, and Spellseeker. In response, Spencer casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Glenhorn. In response, Cal activates Glenhorn, looting, dealing 1 damage to Spencer, and creating a treasure through Malcolm. He activates Glenhorn again, repeating the process. He activates it 1 more time, looking for an answer. Unfortunately, he cannot find an answer, and Swords to Plowshares resolves, exiling Glenhorn, with Cal gaining 2 life. Spencer then blocks Spellseeker with his own Spellseeker and takes the rest. Malcolm triggers and Cal creates a treasure. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Spencer casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Lion's Eye Diamond onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Spencer. Spencer draws and casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He transmutes Muddle the Mixture, fetching up an Underworld Breach into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He cracks his LED, adding 3 blue and discarding his hand, including his commander Ishai. He moves Ishai to the command zone. He escapes Spellseeker. In response, Cal casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Spellseeker, paying for Esper Sentinel. Spellseeker is countered, and Spencer follows it up by escaping LED. He cracks it, adding 3 blue. He escapes Spellseeker again. It enters, and he fetches up a Brain Freeze into his hand. He escapes LED and cracks it, adding 3 blue and discarding Brain Freeze. Unfortunately, he realizes he doesn't have enough cards in his graveyard to escape Brain Freeze. With no cards in his hand and no way to fill his graveyard, Spencer puts Sadness onto the stack, and it resolves. Spencer passes the turn, seeing his fate. Cal untaps and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Spencer with Malcolm. Spencer takes it, and Cal wins the game. And Isaac gets to start us off. But Chris has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Simeon Spirit Guide. Isaac draws a card for turn and plays a Mishra's Workshop. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Gilded Lotus. He casts Rhystic Study. The rest of the table stares at Isaac in disbelief, and Isaac passes the turn. Austin draws a card for turn and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Flooded Strand. Rhystic triggers, and Isaac draws. He pays 2 life to cast Jitaxian Probe, targeting Cal. Rhystic triggers, and Austin pays. He looks at Cal's hand and draws a card. Austin passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers, and Isaac draws. He casts a Dockside Extortionist, paying the Rhystic tax. It enters, and Cal creates 4 treasures. He casts his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, paying the Rhystic tax. All through, Cal passes. Chris draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers, and Isaac draws. He casts his commander, Grenzo, Dungeon Warden, where X equals 0, paying for Rhystic. He casts Mox Opal, paying for Rhystic again. Finished up, Chris passes. During his upkeep, Isaac loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Grim Monolith. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Una, Queen of the Fae. He casts Mox Opal. Isaac ends his turn. At the end of Isaac's turn, Austin casts Brainstorm. Rhystic triggers, and Isaac draws. Then Austin draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. The turn moves to Austin. Austin draws and plays a command tower. He casts a Jeweled Lotus, paying for Rhystic. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. Rhystic triggers, and Isaac draws. Finished up, Austin passes. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts Professional Facebreaker, paying the Rhystic tax. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Malcolm. Chris takes it, Malcolm and Facebreaker trigger, and Cal creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Cal casts a Mystic Remora, paying the Rhystic tax. Crom triggers, and Austin draws. Cal ends his turn. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a High Market. He activates Grenzo, putting Strip Mine from the bottom of his library into his graveyard. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. Rhystic triggers, and Isaac draws. He activates Grenzo, putting Sulphurous Springs from the bottom of his library into his graveyard. Chris ships the turn to Isaac. At the end of Chris's turn, Isaac activates Una for 3, naming red, targeting Cal. Cal exiles Gamble, Jessica's Will, and Mistcast, and Isaac creates 2 fairies. The turn moves to Isaac. During his upkeep, Isaac wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Basalt Monolith. He casts Bolus's Citadel. Remora triggers, and Cal draws. Crom triggers, and Austin draws. Citadel resolves, and Isaac looks at the top card. He does nothing else, surprisingly, and passes the turn. Austin draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Austin passes. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Also in his upkeep, he pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Training Center. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Malcolm and Austin with Facebreaker. Both take it, Malcolm and Facebreaker trigger, and Cal creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Cal casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, paying for Rhystic. All through, Cal ends his turn. During his upkeep, Chris loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Jessica's Will, targeting Austin, paying for Rhystic. Remora triggers, and Cal draws. In response, Austin casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing his Bayou, paying for Rhystic. Remora triggers, and Cal draws again. Crop Rotation resolves, and Austin fetches up a Boseiju, who shelters all, onto the battlefield tapped. Then Jessica's Will resolves, Chris adds 5 red, and then exiles Bloodstained Mire, Vampiric Tutor, and Priest of Gix off of the top of his library. He plays a Bloodstained Mire from exile. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Priest of Gix from exile, paying for Rhystic. Crom triggers and Austin draws. Priest enters and Chris adds 3 black. He casts Vampiric Tutor from exile. Remora triggers and Cal draws. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers and Chris surveils, putting Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth into his graveyard. Then Vampiric Tutor resolves and he fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Next, Chris casts Ironcrag Feet, paying for Rhystic. Remora triggers and Cal draws. In response, Isaac activates Una for 2, naming black, targeting Chris. Chris sighs because he just tutored, and he exiles Deflecting Swat and Praetor's Grasp, and Isaac creates a fairy. With Ironcrag Feet on the stack, Cal casts Swan Song. Rhystic triggers and Isaac draws. Ironcrag is countered and Chris creates a 2/2 bird. Finished up, Chris passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Isaac activates Una for 3, naming black, targeting Austin. Austin exiles Mystic Remora, Bloodstained Mire, and Ottawara, Soaring City. Austin cries at his lost Remora, and the turn moves to Isaac. During his upkeep, Isaac wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Academy Ruins. He pays 2 life to cast Power Artifact from the top of his library through Bolas' Citadel, targeting his Grim Monolith. Remora triggers and Cal draws. In response, Cal casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Isaac casts Swan Song. Remora and Crom trigger, and Cal and Austin draw. In response, Austin casts Pyroblast, targeting Power Artifact. Mystic and Rhystic triggers, and Cal and Isaac draw. With nothing else, Pyroblast counters Power Artifact, Swan Song counters Fierce, and Cal creates 2/2 bird. Plans thwarted, Isaac passes. Austin draws and plays a Taiga. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch. Rhystic triggers and Isaac draws. He taps his Beseiju to help cast his own Rhystic Study. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Cal and Isaac draw. In response, Cal casts Red Elemental Blast. Rhystic triggers and Isaac draws again. Red Blast counters Rhystic, and Austin ships his turn. During his upkeep, Cal lets his Remora die. Also in his upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Soul Ring, paying the Rhystic tax. He casts a Chrome Mox, paying the tax again. Crom triggers and Austin draws. Chrome Mox resolves and Cal imprints Elvish Mystic. With nothing else, Cal passes. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and activates Grenzo, putting Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker into his graveyard, then puts it onto the battlefield. He activates Kiki Jiki, targeting his Priest of Gix. In response, Isaac flashes in an Opposition Agent. In response, Cal casts Mystical Tutor, paying the Rhystic tax. It resolves and he fetches up a Finale of Devastation onto the top of his library. Then Op Agent resolves, then Kiki's ability resolves, and Chris creates a copy of Priest of Gix. Gix enters and Chris adds 3 black. He activates Grenzo, putting Ancient Tomb from the bottom of his library into his graveyard. He activates Grenzo, putting Mountain from the bottom into his graveyard. He activates Grenzo again, putting Tainted Pact from the bottom into his graveyard. He attacks Isaac with his token Priest of Gix. Isaac blocks with Una. Finished up, and not getting the results he wanted, Chris passes the turn. At the end of Chris's turn, Isaac activates Una, naming green, targeting Cal. Cal sighs, because he just tutored, and Cal exiles Finale of Devastation, Survival of the Fittest, and Breeding Pool. Then Isaac creates 2 fairies. Cal tells the table to stop tutoring into Una, and the turn moves to Isaac. During his upkeep, Isaac loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and pays 2 life to cast Copy Artifact off of the top of his library through Citadel. It enters as a copy of Gilded Lotus. He pays 2 life to cast Painter's Servant off of the top through Citadel. It enters and Isaac names blue. He casts Transmute Artifact. In response, Austin casts Veil of Summer to dig for an answer. In response, Isaac pays 2 life to cast Counterspell off of the top through Citadel. Veil is countered and Transmute Artifact resolves. Isaac sacrifices Grim Monolith and fetches up Rings of Brighthearth onto the battlefield, paying the difference. He taps his Basalt Monolith for 3 colorless. He pays 3 to activate the untap ability of Basalt. He pays 2 to activate Rings of Brighthearth, copying the ability. The ability resolves, Basalt untaps, and before the second ability resolves, Isaac taps Basalt for 3 colorless and activates Rings of Brighthearth for 2, copying the ability again. He presents a loop of copying Basalt's ability over and over, netting more and more mana each time. He taps his Gilded Lotus and adds 3 blue. He activates Una's ability, naming blue, targeting each opponent. He exiles each opponent's library and creates a massive amount of fairies. He passes the turn. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Isaac wins the game. And Dante gets to start us off. Dante draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn. Drake draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He also casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. In what feels like major deja vu, Drake sends the turn to Philip. Philip draws and plays a mountain. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a mountain. He casts Ruby Medallion. He ships his turn. Cal draws and plays a command tower. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Stomping Ground. He casts Finehorn Elves and ends his turn. Dante draws and plays a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Dante creates 3 treasures. He casts his own Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He moves to combat and swings Ragavan at Philip. Philip takes it, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Philip exiles a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer from the top of his library, and then Dante creates 2 treasures. Dante passes to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Philip with Ragavan. Philip takes it, and Ragavan triggers. Philip exiles Goblin Welder from the top of Philip's library, and Drake creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Esika, God of the Tree. He ends his turn. Philip draws and plays a mountain. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and in response, Dante sacks his 3 treasures to float 3 blue. Philip then creates 3 treasures through Dockside and then casts his commander, Atsushi, the Blazing Sky. In response, Dante casts Intuition, targeting Drake. Dante fetches up a Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat, and a Pact of Negation. Drake chooses Fierce Guardianship, and Dante puts it into his hand. Atsushi resolves, and Philip ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and casts a Mana Vault. He moves to combat and swings Malcolm at Drake. Drake takes it, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. With no other actions, he passes. During his draw step, Dante takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts Glenhorn Buccaneer. In response, Drake casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Glenhorn. In response, Dante casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Force of Will. In response, Cal casts a Fierce Guardianship of his own for its alternate cost, targeting Dante's Fierce Guardianship. Fierce counters Fierce, and Force of Will counters Glenhorn. With his win attempt stopped, Dante moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Malcolm and Cal with Ragavan and Dockside. They both take it, and Malcolm and Ragavan trigger. Cal exiles Rejuvenating Springs from the top of his library, and then Dante creates 3 treasures. Dante gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Dante with Ragavan and Cal with Esika. They both take it, and Ragavan triggers. Dante exiles a Dispel from the top of Dante's library, and Drake creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Sleight of Hand. He looks at the top 2 cards of his library, puts one into his hand, and then the other on bottom. He casts a Soul Ring. He sends the turn to Philip. Philip draws and casts a Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Tatsushi and Dante with Dockside. They both take it, and Facebreaker triggers, creating 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Philip sacrifices a treasure to activate Professional Facebreaker, exiling Valakut Awakening from the top of his library. He plays Valakut Stoneforge into play tap from exile as his land for turn. He casts Molten Echoes, naming Dragon as it enters. All through, he passes to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Malcolm. Drake takes it, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Birds of Paradise. He ships the turn. During his draw step, Dante takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts his commander, Bruce Tarl, Boorish Herder. It enters, and he gives Ragavan double strike and lifelink until end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Malcolm, Cal with Dockside, and Philip with Ragavan. Before damage, Drake casts Repeal, where X equals 3, targeting Malcolm. Malcolm is bounced to Dante's hand, and Drake draws a card. Cal and Philip take it, Dante gains 4 life, and Ragavan triggers twice due to double strike. Philip exiles a mountain off of the top of his library and a Duretti Scrap Savant off of the top of his library. Then Dante creates 2 treasures. He plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Duretti Scrap Savant from exile. He activates Duretti's first ability, discarding Malcolm, sending it to the command zone, and Ottawara, Soaring City, then draws 2 cards. All through, Dante ends his turn. At the end of Dante's turn, Drake pays 2 life to help cast Noxious Revival, putting Force of Will onto the top of his library. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Ragavan and Esika. Cal blocks Ragavan with Finehorn Elves. Before damage, Drake casts Ad Nauseam. It resolves, and he reveals a Rhystic Study, Abundant Harvest, Mox Diamond, Gemstone Mine, Marsh Flats, Vanishing Knack, Consider, City of Brass, Jataxian Probe, Preordain, Breeding Pool, Vampiric Tutor, Mental Note, Silence, Land Grant, Past in Flames, and a Jeweled Amulet, deciding to stop there. Then Finehorn Elves and Ragavan trade, and Cal takes the rest. In his second main phase, Drake plays a Gemstone Mine as his land for turn. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Breeding Pool. He casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Dante. He looks at Dante's hand and draws a card. Drake casts Jeskai Ascendancy. In response, Dante casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Jeskai Ascendancy. In response, Drake casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Force of Negation. Force of Negation is countered, and Jeskai Ascendancy resolves. Drake casts Jeweled Amulet. Jeskai Ascendancy triggers. Drake untaps his creatures and gives them +1/+1 until end of turn. Then Drake draws and discards. He casts Consider. Jeskai Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures and draws and discards. Consider resolves, and he looks at the top card, putting Manamorphose into his graveyard, and then draws a card. He casts Mental Note. Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures, then draws and discards. Mental Note resolves, and he mills 2 and draws. He casts Serum Visions. Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures, and draws and discards. Visions resolves, and Drake draws again, then scries 2. He casts Mana Vault. Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures and draws and discards. He casts Preordain. Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures and then draws and discards. Preordain resolves and he scries 2 and draws. He casts Veil of Summer. Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures and he draws and discards. Veil resolves and he draws again. He casts Silence. Ascendancy triggers, Drake untaps his creatures and then draws and discards. Silence resolves, locking out his opponents this turn. He casts Banishing Knack, targeting Esika. Ascendancy triggers, he untaps his creatures and draws and discards. He taps his Mana Vault, adding 3 colorless. He taps Esika to return Mana Vault to his hand. He casts Mana Vault. Ascendancy triggers, he untaps his creatures and draws and discards. He taps Esika to return Mana Vault to his hand and then immediately recasts it. Ascendancy triggers, he untaps his creatures and draws and discards. He unearths Fate Stitcher, returning it from the graveyard to the battlefield. He activates Fate Stitcher to untap Esika. He taps Esika to return Mana Vault to his hand. He casts Mana Vault yet again. Ascendancy triggers, he untaps his creatures and draws and discards. Drake demonstrates a loop of returning an opponent's non-land permanent to hand through Esika, untapping Esika with Fate Stitcher, returning Mana Vault to his hand through Esika, and then recasting Mana Vault to untap his creatures and loot. He repeats this process until he's returned all of his opponent's non-land permanents and looted through his deck. Finally, Drake casts Thassa's Oracle. With no responses from his opponents and with an empty library, Drake wins the game. And Cal gets to start us off. But Zane and Noah have pre-game actions. Zane puts a Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling an offer you can't refuse. Apparently, he could refuse it. And then Noah puts a Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mana Confluence. Cal draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal and passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts an Arbor Elf. He passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Zane casts a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Zane draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw. With a huge start in the books, Zane ends his turn. Noah draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Mana Vault. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his own Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Cal passes. Sean draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps his Grove to help cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Sean ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zane wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Noah with Malcolm and Magda. Magda triggers and Zane creates a treasure. Noah takes it and Malcolm triggers, creating another treasure. All through, Zane passes. Noah draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. It enters as a copy of Krark. Noah passes to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zane with Malcolm. Zane takes it and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts Professional Facebreaker. Cal ships the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Sean creates 4 treasures. He taps his Waterlogged Grove to help cast a Devoted Druid. Sean passes. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his own Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and with a trigger on the stack, Sean cracks his treasures. Then Zane creates 1 lowly treasure, which feels extra bad. Zane attempts to move to combat and, in response, Sean uses his floating mana to help activate Thrasios. He scries 1 and reveals a volcanic island onto the battlefield tapped. Then Zane attacks Noah with Magda and Malcolm. Magda triggers and creates a treasure. Noah takes it and Malcolm triggers, creating another treasure. In his second main phase, Zane sacrifices 5 treasures to activate Magda. He fetches up a Bolas's Citadel onto the battlefield. He looks at the top card of his library. He pays 3 life to cast Necropotence off of the top of his library through Citadel, which is quite frankly a really fantastic card to hit. In response, Noah taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Bolas's Citadel. Krark and Sakashima trigger. He loses his first flip, returning Rift to his hand. He wins his second flip, copying Rift, targeting Citadel. In response, Zane casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting the copy of Cyclonic Rift. In response, Noah casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Necropotence and Fierce Guardianship. Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah loses both flips, returning Mindbreak Trap to his hand. He recasts Mindbreak Trap. Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah wins both, copying it 2 times with the same targets for each copy. With nothing else, Mindbreak Trap resolves, exiling Necro and Fierce, the copies fizzle, then the Cyclonic Rift copy resolves, bouncing Bolas's Citadel back to Zane's hand. With his win attempt foiled by those pesky Krarks, Zane passes the turn. During his draw step, Noah takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Arid Mesa for turn. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Krark's Thumb. He cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. Noah ends his turn. Cal draws and casts Keen Sense, targeting his Malcolm. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Malcolm and Zane with Professional Facebreaker. Both take it, and Malcolm, Facebreaker, and Keen Sense all trigger. Cal creates 3 treasures and draws a card. In his second main phase, Cal activates Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure, exiling Wandering Archaic off of the top of his library. He casts Eternal Witness. It enters, and Cal returns Scalding Tarn from his graveyard to his hand. He plays Scalding Tarn as his land for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. All through, Cal ships the turn to Sean. Sean draws and casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He casts Swift Reconfiguration, targeting his Devoted Druid. This is a big problem, so in response, Noah casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Devoted Druid. Krark and Sakashima trigger. In response to the triggers, Sean floats a green with Devoted Druid. He activates Devoted Druid, putting a -1/-1 counter on it, untapping it. He then floats another green. Then the Krark triggers resolve. Noah flips 2 for each trigger through Krark's thumb. Noah selects Bounce with the first trigger and then Copy with the second. Then Devoted Druid bounces and Swift Reconfiguration fizzles. Next, Sean taps his Waterlogged Grove to help cast Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He follows it up with a Basalt Monolith. In response, Cal casts an offer you can't refuse. Basalt is countered and Sean creates 2 treasures. A mildly irritated Sean sacks a treasure for double green through Kinnan and recasts Devoted Druid. Sean finally ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Malcolm and Magda and Cal with Dockside. Magda triggers and Zane creates a treasure. They both take it, Malcolm triggers, and Zane creates 2 more treasures. In his second main phase, he recasts Bolas' Citadel. In response, Sean casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Citadel. Thwarted again, Zane passes. During his draw step, Noah takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Sakashima. Zane takes it, and in his second main phase, Noah casts Light Up the Stage for its spectacle cost. Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah double rolls and chooses Copy. It resolves, and Noah exiles Desperate Ritual and exiles Pyroblast off at the top of his library. His second Krark trigger resolves, Noah double rolls and chooses Copy again. Noah exiles Dualcaster Mage and exiles Veyron, Voice of Duality. Then the original Light Up the Stage resolves, and Noah exiles Brainstorm and Springleaf Drum. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Springleaf Drum. He casts Desperate Ritual from exile. Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah double rolls, chooses Bounce, then double rolls and chooses Copy. He adds 3 red. He recasts Desperate Ritual. Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah double rolls, choosing Copy, creating 3 red, then double rolls, choosing Bounce, returning it to his hand. He casts Desperate Ritual again. He double rolls for both triggers, copies, and bounces, and adds 3 more red. He casts Veyron, Voice of Duality. He casts Brainstorm. Krark and Sakashima trigger twice through Veyron. Noah double rolls for all 4, choosing to copy 3 times and bounce for 1. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top 3 times. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Brainstorm. He casts Solve the Equation. Krark and Sakashima trigger twice each. Noah double rolls, bouncing it. He double rolls, copying it. He fetches up a Strike It Rich into his hand. He double rolls, copying it. He fetches up a Gamble into his hand. He double rolls, copying it one last time. He fetches up a Brightstone Ritual into his hand. He casts Brightstone Ritual. Krark and Sakashima trigger twice each. Noah double rolls for all 4, choosing to copy 3 times and bounce once. He adds 12 red. Noah casts Gamble. Krark and Sakashima each trigger twice. Noah double rolls, bouncing it. He double rolls, copying it. He fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Desperate Ritual. He double rolls, copying it. He fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Grape Shot. He double rolls one last time, copying it. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Remand. Noah casts Stormkiln Artist. He casts Underworld Breach. He escapes Grape Shot from his graveyard with all copies targeting Zane. Stormkiln Artist triggers and creates, a lot of treasures. Noah then presents a loop of casting Grape Shot, copying and bouncing it to his hand through Krark and Sakashima. If he gets unlucky and it ends up in his graveyard, he just escapes it and continues the chain. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Noah wins the game.
And Adam gets to start us off. Adam draws and plays a Training Center. He passes. Trey draws and plays an Urza Saga. It gets a lore counter and he casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks Lotus to cast his commander, Orvar, the All-Form. It enters and he ends the turn. Cal draws and plays Tropical Island. He casts Elvish Mystic. Cal passes. McCoy draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Mana Crypt. He plays Waterlogged Grove. He taps Grove to cast a turn 1 Time Twister. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7. He cracks his Petal to cast Llanowar Elves. Sitting in a good spot, McCoy ships the turn. Adam draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Sunken Hollow into play tapped. He ends the turn. Trey draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a snow-covered island. He moves to combat and attacks McCoy with Orvar. McCoy takes the hit, and Trey gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays the Stomping Grounds into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, McCoy loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a snow-covered island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Felwar Stone. He follows it up with a turn 2 Consecrated Sphinx. Sphinx resolves, and sitting in an even better spot, McCoy ships the turn. Adam draws, Sphinx triggers, and McCoy draws 2. In his main phase, Adam plays Luxury Suite. He casts Rite of Flame. He adds 2 red and casts his commander, Kess, Dissident Mage. Adam ends the turn. At the end of Adam's turn, Trey casts Glamour Die, targeting Urza Saga. Orvar triggers, and he creates a copy of Urza Saga. Saga enters with the lore counter, and the turn moves to Trey. Trey draws, Sphinx triggers, and McCoy draws 2. In his main phase, both of his Urza Sagas trigger. The token copy gets a lore counter, and in response to the original, he floats a mana, then sacrifices Saga and fetches a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He casts Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control with Consecrated Sphinx. He follows it up with a Mind Stone. With nothing else, Trey passes. Cal draws, Sphinx triggers, and Trey draws 2. In his main phase, Cal plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps Grove to cast Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Elvish Mystic as an additional cost. He fetches up a Gilded Drake of his own onto the battlefield. It enters and targets Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Trey sacrifices Mind Stone to draw a card. Drake then exchanges control with Consecrated Sphinx. He follows it up with an Allosaurus Shepherd. With the table playing Hot Potato with Con Sphinx, Cal ends the turn. During his upkeep, McCoy wins his mana crypt roll. He draws, Sphinx triggers, and Cal draws 2. In his main phase, McCoy plays a Tropical Island. He casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the top of his library. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5 cards of his library, and reveals, you guessed it, Hullbreaker Horror, putting it into play. He casts Chromox. Hullbreaker triggers, and he bounces his Mana Crypt to hand. Chromox enters, and he imprints Mental Misstep. He casts Mana Crypt. Hullbreaker triggers, and he returns Mox Amber to his hand. He demonstrates a loop of casting Mox Amber, floating mana from Crypt, bouncing Crypt, then doing the same for Mox Amber. He generates infinite mana. On the final iteration, he bounces Consecrated Sphinx to his hand. He activates Kinnan until he finds Thrasios, Triton Hero, putting it into play. He then activates Thrasios over and over, drawing his deck. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. He casts all the creatures in his deck and follows it up with the Finale of Devastation, where X equals 1 septillion. He moves to combat and attacks his opponents, killing them and winning the game. Adam wins a little superstar dance competition and gets to start us off. Adam draws a card for turn and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Chromox, imprinting Fierce Guardianship. He casts a Mana Vault. He floats mana from his vault and casts Windfall. The table suddenly reevaluates their position, and Windfall resolves. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. Adam casts Mox Opal. He casts Talisman of Progress. Finished up, Adam passes the turn. Shinta draws a card for turn and plays a Hollowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Opt, scrying 1 and drawing a card. Shinta passes. Cal draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Carpet of Flowers. In response, Shinta pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Carpet. Cal sighs and gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts Ornithopter. Charles passes. During his draw step, Adam takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He casts Paladin class. He casts his commander, a Shy, Ojutai Dragon Speaker. Adam ends his turn. Shinta draws and plays an Adakar Waste for turn. Shinta passes. Cal draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He casts an Arbor Elf. A Shy triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Cal ships the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Sarah Ascendant, and a Shy gets a counter. Charles gives the turn to Adam. At the end of Charles' turn, Cal cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. During his draw step, Adam takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Shinta with a Shy. Shinta takes 3, and in his second main phase, Adam casts Arcane Signet. He casts his other commander, Tevish Zot, Doom of Fools. He activates Tevish's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. Adam passes the turn. Shinta draws and plays a Lava Glide Pathway as his land for turn. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Flusterstorm. Shinta ends his turn. Cal draws and casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. A Shy triggers and gets a counter. Cal gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Tevesh with Sarah Ascendant. Tevesh dies and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, Charles casts Seal of Cleansing, giving a Shy a counter. Charles ends his turn. During his upkeep, Adam pays 4 to untap Mana Vault. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with a Shy. Charles takes 6, and in his second main phase, Adam casts Grim Monolith. Adam passes the turn. Shinta draws and casts Verity Circle, giving a Shy counter. Shinta passes. Cal draws and starts off his turn by casting Phantasmal Image, giving a Shy a counter. Image resolves and enters as a copy of Adam's a Shy. Cal moves to combat and attacks Shinta with Malcolm. Shinta takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. Cal ends his turn. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Sarah Ascendant. Cal takes it, and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, Charles casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Both the Shies trigger, and in response, Shinta casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Adam's a Shy. Both the Shies trigger again, and in response, Adam casts Miscast, targeting Swords. Cal's a Shy triggers again. Cal's a Shy gets a counter, Miscast counters Swords to Plowshares, both the Shies get a counter, then they both get another counter, then, finally, Thalia resolves. All finished up with 1/1 counters getting thrown around like candy, Charles ends the turn. Adam draws and activates Paladin class, leveling it up, giving his creatures +1/+1. He activates Paladin class, leveling it up again. He moves to combat, attacking Cal with a Shy. Paladin class triggers, giving a Shy double strike. Cal chump blocks with his own a Shy. The bird battle in the sky concluded, Adam passes. Shinta draws and casts his commander, Hinata, Dawncrowned. A Shy triggers and gets a counter. Shinta ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with Malcolm. Adam takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts Gilded Drake. Adam sighs. A Shy triggers and gets a counter. Drake enters and exchanges control of Adam's a Shy. Feeling pretty good about himself, Cal passes. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Thalia and Sarah Ascendant. Cal takes it, and Charles gains 6. Charles gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws and casts Esper Sentinel. Adam's a Shy, controlled by Cal, gets a counter. Feeling sick about all that, Adam moves to combat. He attacks Shinta with Gilded Drake and Cal with his 2 Thralls, all of which get +1/+1 through Paladin class. Paladin class triggers targeting Gilded Drake, giving it +2/+2 and double strike. Both declare no blocks and take it all. Adam ends his turn. Shinta draws and taps his Adakar Waste to help cast Curse of the Swine, targeting every opponent's creatures, all reduced through Hinata. A Shy gets a counter, and Adam draws through Esper Sentinel. In response, Cal casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Curse of the Swine. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Cal pays. Curse is countered, and Shinta moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Hinata, Cal takes it, and Shinta passes the turn. Cal draws, taps his Taiga, and then activates Arbor Elf to untap it. Verity Circle triggers, and Shinta draws. Cal casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 3. Esper triggers, and Adam draws. Finale resolves, and Cal fetches up a Glinthorn Buccaneer. Cal moves to combat, and in response, Adam casts Winds of Rebuke, targeting Malcolm. A Shy triggers and gets a counter. Malcolm bounces back to Cal's hand, and everyone mills 2. Cal attacks Shinta with Glinthorn Buckaroo, and Adam with his own a Shy. Adam gets bird slapped for 15 with his own bird, and Shinta takes 2. Finished up, Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Charles activates Homeward Path, which everyone forgot was on the board. Everyone regains control of all of their own creatures in order to keep the targets on Adam and away from Charles. Cal sighs, Adam cheers, and Charles moves to his turn. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Adam with Thalia and Sarah Ascendant. Adam takes it, and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, Charles casts Steel Shaper's Gift. Esper and a Shy trigger, a Shy gets a counter, and Adam draws. Steel Shaper's Gift resolves, and Charles fetches up a Blade of Selves into his hand. Charles passes the turn. Adam draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with a Shy. Paladin class triggers targeting a Shy and giving it double strike. Cal cannot do anything about it, takes the hit, and dies. In his second main phase, Adam casts Ashiok, Dream Render. He activates Ashiok, targeting Charles. Charles mills 4, and then each opponent exiles their graveyard. Adam casts Grafdigger's Cage. Shinta thinks about a line that doesn't involve Breach now, and Adam passes the turn. Shinta draws and casts Esper Sentinel. Ashai triggers and gets a counter. He moves to combat and attacks Adam with Hinata. Adam takes it and Shinta passes. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Adam with Sarah Ascendant and Shinta with Thalia. Both declare no blocks, take the damage, and Adam dies. Charles gains 6 life, and in his second main phase, he casts Martyred Rusalka. Charles gives the turn to Shinta. Shinta draws and casts Archmage Emeritus. He passes. At the end of Shinta's turn, Charles sacrifices Seal of Cleansing, destroying Shinta's Chrome Mox. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He moves to combat and attacks Shinta with Sarah Ascendant. Shinta takes it, and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, Charles casts Archon of Emeria. He passes. Shinta draws, takes no actions, and passes. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Shinta with Sarah Ascendant. Shinta takes it, and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, Charles casts Thalia, Heretic Cathar. In response, Shinta taps Akadar Waste to help cast Mana Drain. Archmage triggers and Shinta draws. Thalia is countered, and Charles gives the turn to Shinta. Shinta draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 3 colorless through Mana Drain. He casts Heat Shimmer, targeting Archmage. Archmage triggers, and Shinta draws. Shimmer resolves, and Shinta creates a copy of Archmage. In desperation, Shinta attacks Charles with everything. Charles blocks Archmage with Thalia and Esper Sentinel with his Archon. Charles takes the rest, and Shinta passes the turn. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Shinta with everything except his Ornithopter. Shinta takes it, dies, and Charles wins the game. And Shinta gets to start us off. But Cal has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns into play with a luck counter, exiling Mana Drain. Shinta draws for turn and plays an island. He passes. Adam draws and plays an Agadim, the Undercrypt, tapped. He ends the turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Mox Opal. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He cracks his Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He ends the turn. Shinta draws and plays a Swamp. He passes. Adam draws, and he starts his turn off by paying 2 life to cast Gataxian Probe, targeting Shinta. He looks at Shinta's hand and draws a card. He plays a Command Tower. He casts Chains of Mephistopheles. It enters, and the turn moves to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Crystal Vein. He sacrifices Crystal Vein to cast Grim Monolith. He casts Pithy Needle. It enters, and he names Glinthorn Buccaneer. He casts Oswald Fiddlebender. He follows it up with a Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and Charles fetches Nim Death Mantle into his hand. Charles ends the turn. Cal draws and plays a Training Center. He casts Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Cal passes. Shinta draws and casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3 cards of his library, rearranges, and discards, then draws through Chains. He plays Mystic Sanctuary tapped. He ends the turn. Adam draws and plays a Watery Grave tapped. He casts Fairy Seer. It enters, and he scries 2. Adam ends the turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He activates Oswald, sacrificing Mox Opal, and fetches Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He activates Stoneforge, putting Nim Death Mantle onto the battlefield. He casts Blind Obedience. With nothing else, Charles ends the turn. Cal draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Charles with Malcolm. Charles takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure tapped through Blind Obedience. Cal gives the turn to Shinta. Shinta draws and plays an island. He casts his commander, Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow. It enters tapped through Blind Obedience, and Shinta ends the turn. Adam draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He moves to combat and attacks Shinta with Fairy Seer. Shinta declares no blocks, and before damage, Adam Nujitsu's Yuriko, returning Fairy Seer to his hand. Shinta takes the hit, and Yuriko triggers, revealing Mystical Tutor into his hand, with each opponent losing 1 life. In his second main phase, Adam recasts Fairy Seer. It enters tapped and scries 2. With nothing else, Adam passes. Charles draws and floats mana with his Soul Ring. He activates Oswald, sacrificing Soul Ring, and fetches an Arcane Signet onto the battlefield. He casts Mirage Mirror, extorting it through Blind Obedience. Charles ends his turn. Cal draws and plays Rejuvenating Springs. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Malcolm. Charles takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers, creating a tapped treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts his other commander, Tana, the Bloodsower. It enters tapped, and he ends the turn. Shinta draws and moves to combat, attacking Adam with Yuriko. Adam takes a hit, Yuriko triggers, and reveals a swamp into his hand. In his second main phase, he plays a swamp. He casts Ingenious Infiltrator. It enters tapped, and he passes. Adam draws and plays Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Shinta with Yuriko. Shinta takes the hit, Yuriko triggers, and reveals Universal Automaton into his hand, with each opponent losing 1 life. In his second main phase, he casts Universal Automaton. It enters tapped, and he gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and starts his turn off by activating Oswald, sacrificing Grim Monolith, and fetching up an Ashnod's altar onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Oswald and Stoneforge to Ashnod's, adding 4 colorless. He casts his commander, Al, the Dawn Sky. It enters, and he sacrifices Al to Ashnod's, putting Al into his graveyard. Nim Death Mantle and Al trigger. He looks at the top 7 cards of his library, puts Tocatli Honor Guard, Martyred Rusalka, and On Thin Ice onto the battlefield. On Thin Ice triggers and targets Adam's Yuriko, exiling it. With Nim Death Mantle's trigger still on the stack, Charles sacrifices Martyred Rusalka to Ashnod's altar to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al to the battlefield. He sacrifices Al to Ashnod's, triggering Death Mantle and Al. He looks at the top 7 and reveals Leonin Relic Warder onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Relic Warder to Ashnod's and pays for Nim Death Mantle. Al returns to the battlefield and Charles sacrifices Al to Ashnod's again, triggering Nim Death Mantle and Al. He looks at the top 7 and reveals Remorseful Cleric and Lion Sash, putting them onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Lion Sash to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al to the battlefield. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Thalia, Heretic Cathar, and Manavault onto the battlefield. He taps Manavault to pay for Nim Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Vryn Wingmere, Portable Hole, and Lion's Eye Diamond onto the battlefield. Portable Hole enters and targets Cal's treasure. In response, Cal cracks his treasure, floating a blue. Charles cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He pays for Nim Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Cathar Commando, Moonsilver Key, Ornithopter, and Mana Crypt onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Remorseful Cleric to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Sanctifier Onvek and Ornithopter of Paradise onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Ornithopter of Paradise to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Aven Mind Sensor and Paradise Mantle onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Sanctifier Onvek to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Grand Abolisher, Sarah Ascendant, and Weathered Wayfarer onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Wayfarer to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle and returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Mother of Runes and Hushwing Gryff onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Mother of Runes to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Giver of Runes onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Giver to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al again, looking at the top 7, revealing Ranger Captain of Eos and Phyrexian Dreadnought onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Dreadnought to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Auriok Salvagers onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Hushwing Gryff to Ashnod's to pay for Death Mantle, returning Al. He loops Al, looking at the top 7, revealing Relic Vial onto the battlefield. He activates Mirage Mirror, cloning Relic Vial. He sacrifices Vryn Wingmere to Ashnod's, both Relic Vials trigger, and each opponent loses 2 life. He sacrifices Thalia to Ashnod's, with each opponent losing 2 life. He pays for Death Mantle, returning Al. He sacrifices Al, each opponent loses 2 life, and he looks at the top 7, revealing Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and Restoration Specialist onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Specialist to Ashnod's, and each opponent loses 2 life. He pays for Death Mantle, returning Al. He sacrifices Al, each opponent loses 2 life, and he looks at the top 7, revealing Skyclave Apparition onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Skyclave, each opponent loses 2 life, and pays for Death Mantle, returning Al. He sacrifices Al, each opponent loses 2 life, and he looks at the top 7, revealing Spirit of the Labyrinth onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Spirit, each opponent loses 2 life, and pays for Death Mantle, returning Al. He sacrifices Al, each opponent loses 2 life, and he looks at the top 7, revealing Ambitious Farmhand and Aethersworn Canonist onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Ambitious Farmhand to Ashnod's, each opponent loses 2 life, and he pays for Death Mantle, returning Al. He sacrifices Al, each opponent loses 2 life, and he looks at the top 7, revealing Mirror of the Forebears and Darksteel Mutation onto the battlefield. Darksteel Mutation attaches to Malcolm, and he chooses Spirit. He sacrifices Cathar Commando to Altar, each opponent loses 2 life, and he pays for Death Mantle, returning Al. He sacrifices Sarah Ascendant to Ashnod's, and each opponent loses 2 life. He activates Mirror of the Forebears, copying Al. He sacrifices the Forebears copy to the Legend rule, and each opponent loses 2 life. Death Mantle, and Owl trigger. He looks at the top 7 and reveals Archon of Emeria, Esper Sentinel, and a Walking Ballista onto the battlefield. Ballista dies to state-based actions, and each opponent loses 2 life. He sacrifices Owl, each opponent loses 2 life, and he looks at the top 7, revealing Sanctum Prelate and Land Tax onto the battlefield. He names 2 as Prelate Inners. He sacrifices Prelate to Ashnods, each opponent loses 2 life. He sacrifices Aven Mind Sensor, each opponent loses 2 life, and Charles wins the game. Robert won the kangaroo boxing match and gets to start us off. But Zane and Zach have a pre-game action. Zane puts a Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield with a luck counter, exiling Veil of Summer. Zach also puts a gemstone into play with a luck counter, exiling Plateau. Robert draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. In response, Jacob pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Soul Ring. A little dismayed, Robert ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Tinderwall. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ships the turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting Chrome Mox. It enters, and Zach imprints Force of Negation. He plays Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb and casts a turn 1 Smothering Tithe. With his hand now completely empty, Zach passes the turn. Jacob draws, and Zach's Smothering Tithe triggers. Zach creates a treasure. In his first main phase, Jacob plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond. It enters, and he discards Polluted Delta. He casts a Soul Ring. All finished, he passes. Robert draws, not paying for Tithe. He plays Savannah. He casts Wild Growth, targeting Savannah. He gives the turn to Zane. Zane draws, not paying for Tithe. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Malcolm. Zach takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and he passes the turn. Zach draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Narset, Enlightened Master. To Zach's surprise, Narset resolves, and with nothing else, Zach ends his turn. Jacob draws, not paying for Tithe. He pays 2 life to cast Gataxian Probe, targeting Robert. Jacob looks at Robert's hand and draws a card. Tithe triggers, and Zach creates a treasure. Jacob plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He gives the turn to Robert. Robert draws, not paying for Tithe. He plays a Bayou. He casts Sylvan Library. He passes. Zane draws, not paying for Tithe. He casts Glinthorn Buccaneer. The table braces for impact, and Buccaneer resolves. Zane moves to combat, and in response, Jacob casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Buccaneer. Buccaneer is destroyed, and Zane creates a 3/3 Frizzard. Zane attacks Robert with Malcolm. Robert takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, he casts Jeweled Lotus. With nothing else, he gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Robert with Narset, and Narset triggers. The table hangs on to the edge of their seat as Zach exiles Felwar Stone, Scalding Tarn, Polluted Delta, and Hall of the Bandit Lord, completely whiffing. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Felwar Stone. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Aminatu's Augury. In response, Robert casts Pyroblast, countering Augury. Zach gives the turn to Jacob. Jacob draws, not paying for Tithe. He casts his commander, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. He ends the turn. During his draw step, Robert draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library. He pays 8 life, keeping them both. Tithe triggers 3 times, and Zach creates 3 treasures. In his main phase, Robert plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Najila, the Blade Blossom. He passes. Zane draws, not paying for the Tithe. He casts Lotus Petal. He moves to combat and attacks Robert with Malcolm. Robert takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, he casts Birds of Paradise. Zane ends his turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by tapping Ancient Tomb to cast Seagate Restoration. It resolves, Zach draws 2 cards and has no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Steam Vents. He moves to combat and attacks Robert with Narset. Narset triggers, exiling Silence, Narset's Reversal, Cavern of Souls, and Spell Snare. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Silence. He holds priority and casts Narset's Reversal, targeting Silence. Reversal resolves, bouncing Silence back to his hand and creating a copy of Silence. The copy resolves, and a little dismayed at his Narset triggers, Zach ends the turn. Jacob draws, not paying for Tithe. He floats mana from Sol Ring and casts Dramatic Reversal. Rashmi triggers, revealing an island into his hand. Jacob untaps all of his non-land permanents. With nothing else, he ships the turn. Robert draws, not paying for Tithe. He plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Nature's Will. In response, Jacob flashes in an Endurance and Rashmi triggers. Jacob holds priority and casts Brainstorm. In response, Robert casts Swansong, targeting Brainstorm. Brainstorm is countered, and Jacob creates a 2/2 bird. Rashmi's trigger resolves, and Jacob reveals Fierce Guardianship, putting it into his hand. He casts it for its alternative cost, targeting Nature's Will. Will is countered, and Endurance resolves. Endurance triggers, targeting Zach. Zach puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library, and with the stack clear, Robert moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Zach. Zach takes the hit, and with his plans foiled, Robert passes the turn. At the end of Robert's turn, Zane casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Niv Mizzet Perun onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Zane. Zane draws, Tithe triggers, and Zach creates a treasure. Still in the draw step, Zach casts Silence, shutting off his opponents from casting spells this turn. Zane moves to combat and attacks Robert with Malcolm. Robert takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and he ends his turn. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Robert with Narset. Narset triggers, exiling Shatterskull Smashing, Walk the Aeons, Long-Term Plans, and Jessica's Will. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Jessica's Will, targeting Robert. Will resolves. Zach adds 3 red and exiles Karn's Temporal Sundering, Brainstorm, and a Wooded Foothills. He plays Wooded Foothills. He casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 and put 2 back on top. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Waves of Aggression. Waves resolves, and Zach moves to a second combat step. He attacks Robert, and Narset triggers. Zach holds priority and casts Long-Term Plans. He searches his library for a card and puts it third from the top. Narset's trigger resolves, exiling Exotic Orchard, Enter the Infinite, Lion's Eye Diamond, and a Sol Ring. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Sol Ring. He casts LED. He casts Enter the Infinite. Zach draws his library and puts a card from his hand on top of his library. He casts Walk the Aeons, taking an extra turn. He casts Scroll Rack. Zach doesn't discard to hand size due to Enter the Infinite, and he moves to his extra turn. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Zane with Narset. Narset triggers, and in response, Zach activates Scroll Rack, putting 2 cards from his hand on top of his library. Narset's trigger resolves, exiling Beacon of Tomorrows and Nexus of Fate. Zane takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Nexus of Fate. It resolves, shuffles into Zach's library, and Zach gets an extra turn. Zach casts Beacon of Tomorrows. Zach gains an extra turn, and it shuffles into Zach's library. He casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Endurance, and Jacob gains 3 life. Zach moves to his next turn. Zach draws and presents a loop of attacking with Narset, activating Scroll Rack, putting either Nexus of Fate or Beacon of Tomorrows on top of his library, exiling both, and casting them with Narset's ability. He takes infinite turns and attack steps, killing the table and winning the game.
Zach wins the Playing with Power rap freestyle battle and gets to start us off. But Ryan and Mike have pre-game actions. Ryan puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Thunderclap. Mike puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield as well, exiling Wirewood Lodge. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Pact of Negation. He casts an Arcane Signet and passes the turn. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Everyone gets immediately worried, and Cal ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Survivor's Encampment. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He activates Survivor's Encampment, tapping down Ragavan to cast a Spark Mage. With nothing else, Ryan gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus and casts his commander, Narset, Enlightened Master. Now everyone is worried about Zach's commander too, and he gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Tandem Lookout. It enters and soul bonds with Malcolm. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Malcolm. Zach takes it, and Malcolm and Tandem trigger. Cal creates a treasure and draws a card. All through, Cal passes. Ryan draws and plays a Buried Ruin. He casts his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Ragavan and Mike with Spark Mage. Magda triggers and Ryan creates a treasure. Both take it and Ragavan triggers. Ryan creates a treasure and exiles Breeding Pool off of the top of Cal's library. Finished up, Ryan ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Turn Timber, Serpentine Wood into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts Tireless Provisioner. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Narset. Narset triggers and Zach exiles Force of Will, Fury of the Horde, Temporal Manipulation, and a Delay. Cal takes it, and in Zach's second main phase, he casts Fury of the Horde for free through Narset. He untaps his creatures and gets an extra combat. He moves to his second combat and attacks Cal again. Narset triggers again, and Zach exiles Urza's Ruinous Blast, Need for Speed, Dovin's Veto, and Enter the Infinite. Woof. Cal takes the damage, and in Zach's third main phase, he casts Enter the Infinite for free through Narset. In response, Cal casts Red Elemental Blast. In response, Zach casts Delay through Narset, targeting Red Elemental Blast. Delay counters and exiles Red Blast with 3 time counters on it. Enter the Infinite resolves, Zach draws all the cards in his library and puts 1 back on top. Next, he floats mana from his rocks and casts Urza's Ruinous Blast through Narset. In response, Ryan and Cal crack their treasures. Blast resolves and exiles all non-legendary non-land permanents. Zach casts Scroll Rack. He activates Scroll Rack, exiling 3 cards from his hand, putting his last card from his library into his hand, and then rearranging the exiled cards. He casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. He casts Temporal Manipulation through Narset, getting an extra turn. Zach passes to himself. Zach draws and activates Scroll Rack for 1, exiling and rearranging. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Narset. Narset triggers, and Zach exiles the last card of his library, which is Nexus of Fate. Cal takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Nexus of Fate through Narset. Zach gets an extra turn, and Nexus of Fate shuffles into his library. He presents a loop of attacking with Narset, casting Nexus for free, shuffling it in, drawing it on his next turn, and putting it back on top with Scroll Rack. Using this loop, he can take infinite turns and attack each player over and over until they are dead, and Zach wins the game. And Ryan gets to start us off. But Zach has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling part the Water Veil. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a mountain. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts Enslaved Dwarf. He passes. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts Finehorn Elves and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts Torch Courier and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with his Torch Courier. Cal takes it, and Zach passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Finehorn Elves, and with nothing else, he passes. Ryan draws and plays a mountain. He casts his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Enslaved Dwarf. Magda triggers, and Ryan creates a treasure. Zach takes it, and Ryan gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and exiles Elvish Spear Guide to add a green. He casts Yisan the Wanderer Bard. He ships the turn. Zach draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Traders. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks his LED, discarding his hand, and adds 3 red. He casts his commander, Narset, Enlightened Master. He sacrifices Torch Courier to give Narset haste. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Narset. Narset triggers and Zack exiles Azorius Signet, Delay, Wooded Foothills, and a Tundra. Cal takes it, and in his second main phase, Zack casts Azorius Signet. The table breathes a sigh of relief, and with nothing else, Zack passes. Cal draws and plays a Spire Garden. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zack with Magda and Enslaved Dwarf. Magda triggers, and he creates 2 treasures. Zack takes it, and in Ryan's second main phase, he casts Final Fortune. The table gets nervous since Narset was supposed to be the one taking extra turns. Final Fortune resolves, and Ryan gets an extra turn. He ships the turn to himself. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zack with Magda and Enslaved Dwarf. Magda triggers, creating 2 treasures. Zack takes it, and in Ryan's second main phase, he taps Mox Opal for red. He sacrifices 5 treasures to activate Magda. He fetches up a Clock of Omens onto the battlefield. He follows up by casting Metallic Mimic. The entire table really starts to sweat as the combo pieces get assembled. Metallic Mimic resolves, and Ryan names Dwarf as it enters. He taps both Metallic Mimic and Clock of Omens to activate Clock of Omens, targeting Metallic Mimic. Since Mimic is a dwarf, Magda triggers and Ryan creates a treasure. Then Ryan untaps Metallic Mimic. Next, Ryan taps his newly created treasure and Metallic Mimic again to activate Clock of Omens, creating a treasure through Magda and untapping Mimic. He can now repeat this process of tapping Mimic and his treasure to create a new treasure, then untap Mimic. This creates a loop of infinite tapped treasures. Ryan then sacrifices treasures through Magda to fetch up a Mana Crypt onto the battlefield and a Mox Amber onto the battlefield. Ryan sacks treasures through Magda to fetch up Sensei's Divining Top onto the battlefield. He activates the top to draw a card, putting it on top of his library. Ryan now presents another loop where he sacrifices treasures, fetches top onto the battlefield, activates top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Using this loop, he can draw cards in his deck. He draws until he finds the card he needs. He casts Zorn. With Zorn on the battlefield, Ryan is now able to loop Metallic Mimic and Clock of Omens to generate infinite tapped treasures and untapped treasures. After making roughly 1 billion treasures, he casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Mike. He follows up with an Elixir of Immortality. He activates Elixir, gaining 5 life, shuffling his graveyard into his library, including Lightning Bolt. He shows yet another loop where he draws Lightning Bolt and Elixir of Immortality through his top, casts Lightning Bolt, and then shuffles it back in with Elixir. He repeats the process until finally the table is dead.